Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. I'm a journalist by trade, always chasing the next big story, and I've covered everything from local politics to high-profile crime cases. But nothing has ever haunted me like the story I stumbled upon last year. It started as a simple investigation into missing persons cases, a small town with an unusually high number of disappearances. What I uncovered was something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The town was called Dunmore, tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests and fog-shrouded valleys. It was the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving past. Just a few old houses, a gas station, and a diner that looked like it hadn't seen a new customer in decades. I heard about it through a friend of a friend, the kind of tip that usually leads nowhere. But there was something about the way she talked about it. Like Dunmore was a place that people talked about in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might summon something. The records were strange too. In the past 20 years, more than 30 people had gone missing in and around Dunmore. Some were locals. Others were travelers passing through. What was weird was that almost none of these cases were ever reported on in the news. It was like the town existed in its own bubble, detached from the rest of the world. Curious and thinking it might make for a good story, I decided to go there and see what I could find. I arrived in Dunmore late in the afternoon, and the first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. The streets were empty, and the whole place had an eerie stillness, like the entire town was holding its breath. I checked into a shabby little motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where the neon sign flickers and the sheets are never quite clean. The woman at the front desk barely looked up as she handed me the key, and when I asked about the disappearances, she just shrugged, muttering something about people moving on to better places. I spent the first day exploring, asking around, but most of the locals weren't interested in talking. They gave me odd looks, quick glances from beneath furrowed brows, and vague, dismissive answers. The more I pressed, the more uncomfortable they seemed. A few even warned me to leave before dark. I tried to laugh it off, but there was something in their eyes. Something that made my skin crawl. That evening I went to the diner, hoping to catch someone more willing to talk. The place was nearly empty. Just a couple of regulars hunched over their plates, and a waitress who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. I ordered coffee and a sandwich and pulled out my notebook, jotting down observations and thoughts. As I sat there, a man slid into the booth across from me. He was older, with deep lines etched into his face and a haunted look in his eyes. Without introduction, he asked if I was the reporter asking about the missing people. I nodded and he leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "You need to leave," he said, his tone deadly serious. "This town, it's not what it seems. People here don't just go missing. They're taken." "Taken by what?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. He hesitated, glancing around nervously. "It's the town itself, or something in it. I've lived here my whole life, and I've seen it happen. People vanish without a trace, like they never existed. It's like the town swallows them whole." I pressed him for more details, but he clammed up, his gaze darting toward the windows as if expecting to see something lurking outside. He wouldn't say another word, just shook his head and muttered that it was too late for some and I was risking my own safety by being there. That night, back in my motel room, I couldn't shake his words. I tried to brush it off as local superstition, the kind of small-town folklore that always seems to crop up in places like this. But something about the way he spoke, the fear in his eyes, stuck with me. I decided to stay another day, determined to dig deeper. I spent the next morning going through old town records at the local library, but most of the files were missing or incomplete. It was like someone had deliberately erased the town's history. I found a few names of the missing, but no pictures, no addresses, just empty, lifeless records. Then I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold, a faded photograph from the 1960s of a group of townsfolk gathered in front of the diner. It was old and worn, but I recognized some of the faces from my brief time in town, and among them, looking exactly the same, was the man who had warned me the night before. The same clothes, the same haunted expression. It didn't make any sense. He hadn't aged a day. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I shoved the photograph back into the drawer and decided I needed to leave. Something was very wrong with Dunmore, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I hurried back to the motel, packed my things, and checked out. The woman at the desk didn't even glance up as I left, like she already knew I wouldn't be staying long. As I drove out of town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The road twisted and turned through the thick woods, the trees pressing in on both sides. I glanced in my rearview mirror and, for a brief moment, thought I saw figures standing at the edge of the forest watching me. Tall, shadowy silhouettes that seemed to blend into the trees. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but my heart was racing. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, finally pulling over at a gas station to collect myself. I took out my phone to check the photos I'd taken in town, but every file was corrupted, just static and black screens. I checked my notes, but the pages were blank, the ink faded as if it had been washed away. I tried calling the contact who'd tipped me off about Dunmore, but the number was disconnected. It was like everything related to that town was slipping through my fingers, disappearing as if it never existed. When I got home, I did some more research, but every trace of Dunmore was gone. The town wasn't on any maps. The records I'd found online were gone. It was like the place had vanished overnight, leaving no evidence that it had ever been there at all. I even tried reaching out to some of the locals I'd spoken to, but there was nothing. No phone numbers, no addresses. Nothing. I haven't gone back since, and I don't plan to. I've covered plenty of strange stories in my career, but Dunmore was different. It felt like the town itself was alive, like it had a hunger that couldn't be satisfied, and once you stepped into it, it didn't let you go. Every now and then, I'll catch something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that shouldn't be there, or a flicker of movement in a reflection. I tell myself it's nothing, but there's a part of me that knows better. If you ever hear about Dunmore, take my advice, don't go looking for it. Some places are hidden for a reason, because once you find them, they might just find you, and then you might never be seen again. We were a group of 5, me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Mike, Jenny, and Tom. We'd all been talking about doing a camping trip for months, just the 5 of us, far away from the city noise and stress. We settled on Blackwood Forest, a dense, sprawling wilderness about 3 hours away. It wasn't a popular spot. Most people preferred the more established campsites closer to town. But that was the appeal. We wanted isolation, the real wilderness experience. The first day was perfect. We found a great spot near a small, clear stream. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the day hiking, exploring, and laughing at Mike's terrible ghost stories. As the sun set, we settled around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and watching the stars come out. The night was calm, with just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was exactly the kind of escape we'd been looking for. It was around midnight when the first strange thing happened. We were sitting around the fire telling stories when we heard it. A distant, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but it slowly grew louder. We all fell silent, listening. It was coming from deeper in the woods, echoing through the trees. Mike, always the joker, stood up and shined his flashlight into the darkness. "Hello?" he called out, his voice laced with mock fear. "Anybody out there?" There was no response, just the steady tapping. Sarah shivered and moved closer to me. "Probably just a woodpecker," I said, trying to sound confident. But something about the sound didn't feel right. It was too slow, too deliberate, like someone was counting each knock. We laughed it off and went back to our stories, but the atmosphere had shifted. The tapping continued intermittently, always in the distance, never getting closer but never quite going away. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. We doused the fire, zipped up our tents, and settled in. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly because the next thing I knew, I was being shaken awake by Sarah. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I groggily sat up, rubbing my eyes. It took me a moment to register the sound. It was faint, almost like whispering, carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it was there, just outside the tent. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, peering out. The forest was dark and still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I scanned the area with the beam, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The whispering stopped, replaced by the eerie silence of the woods. I shrugged it off as the wind and settled back down, trying to calm Sarah. But deep down, I felt uneasy. It wasn't the wind. I knew that much. The next morning, everyone was on edge. Tom said he'd heard footsteps outside his tent, and Jenny swore she saw shadows moving between the trees. We tried to laugh it off, blaming it on the eerie atmosphere and overactive imaginations, but none of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We decided to go on a long hike, hoping to clear our heads. The sun was high, and the forest looked beautiful, but the sense of unease lingered. As we walked, we noticed strange things. Trees with deep scratches, almost like claw marks, and patches of earth that looked disturbed, as if something had been digging. Mike found a small pile of rocks stacked in a strange pattern, like some sort of marker or boundary. We joked that it was some kind of Blair Witch thing, but none of us were really laughing. The tapping started again that afternoon, echoing through the trees as we made our way back to camp. It seemed to be following us, always at a distance, like it was leading us somewhere. We picked up the pace, trying to ignore it, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we got back to camp, things were worse. Our tents were slashed, the fabric shredded and tossed about. Our supplies were scattered, food ripped open and strewn across the ground. It looked like an animal attack, but there were no tracks, no signs of any wildlife, just the eerie, unnatural damage to our campsite. "What the hell did this?" Jenny whispered, her voice shaking. No one had an answer. We all stood there, staring at the mess, trying to make sense of it. Mike, always the brave one, suggested we pack up and leave. None of us argued. As we hurriedly gathered our things, the whispering started again, louder this time. It was coming from all directions, circling the campsite, like a dozen voices speaking at once. The words were still impossible to make out, but the tone was urgent, frantic. Sarah grabbed my arm, her face pale. "We need to go now." We didn't waste any more time. We stuffed our gear into our packs, leaving behind anything that wouldn't fit, and started back down the trail. The whispering followed, growing louder with every step. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and the tapping started again, echoing through the forest like a taunt. We were almost to the edge of the woods when we saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the trail ahead. It was tall and gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow pits of darkness. It just stood there, swaying slightly, as if it were part of the trees. We all froze, the whispers now a deafening roar in our ears. "What is that?" Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure moved slowly at first, then quicker, lurching towards us in jerky, unnatural movements. We bolted, sprinting off the trail and through the trees, the branches clawing at our clothes and skin. The whispering was all around us, drowning out everything else. I could hear Sarah screaming, but I didn't stop. I just ran, the panic driving me forward. We burst out of the forest and into the parking lot where our cars were. We didn't stop, didn't look back. We peeled into the cars, fumbling with the keys, and peeled out of there, gravel spraying under the tires. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing standing at the edge of the woods, but there was nothing, just the dark, silent trees. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. We found a cheap motel and checked in, locking the doors and barricading ourselves inside. None of us slept that night. We just sat there, staring at the walls, listening to the faint tapping that seemed to echo in our heads. The next morning, we went straight to the ranger station, telling them what happened. They listened politely, but I could tell they didn't believe us. They said they'd check it out, but we never heard back. We drove home, each of us retreating into our own thoughts, the whispers still echoing in our minds. We never spoke about that trip again. We tried to move on, but something changed in us that night. The forest took something from us, our peace, our sense of safety, maybe even a piece of our sanity. Sarah and I broke up a few months later. Mike moved to another state, and the rest of us drifted apart. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear the tapping, soft, rhythmic, like a distant knock. And I can't help but wonder if whatever was in those woods is still out there, watching, waiting, or if it followed us home. The Pine Hollow Forest was a popular camping spot, known for its dense trees, serene lake, and winding trails that stretched for miles. For many, it was a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life, offering a chance to reconnect with nature and enjoy the great outdoors. But Pine Hollow had a darker side that most visitors didn't know about, a history of strange disappearances and eerie tales that locals shared in hushed whispers. The most chilling story was that of the Whistler, a mysterious presence that was said to stalk the forest at night, luring unsuspecting campers with an eerie, haunting whistle. 4 friends, Mark, Lisa, Ben, and Jess, decided to spend a weekend camping in Pine Hollow. They were seasoned campers, always looking for new places to explore, and they had heard great things about the forest. They set up camp near the lake, pitching their tents and building a fire as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves. As they sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows and telling stories, Lisa brought up the legend of the Whistler. She had read about it online, and though she didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural tales, she thought it would be fun to spook her friends. "They say it's a ghost of a lost camper," Lisa explained, her voice low and dramatic. "He got separated from his group and never made it out of the woods. Now, he wanders Pine Hollow, whistling a sad, haunting tune. If you hear it, you're supposed to ignore it. If you whistle back, he'll lead you deeper into the forest until you're lost, too." Mark laughed, tossing another log on the fire. "Come on, Lisa, that's just a story to scare off kids. There's no Whistler." Ben nodded in agreement, though Jess looked a bit uneasy. "Well, let's just hope we don't hear any whistling tonight," she said, glancing nervously at the dark tree line. They continued to chat and joke, but as the night wore on, the forest around them grew unnaturally quiet. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl, faded into an oppressive silence. It was as if the forest were holding its breath. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, the flickering fire casting long shadows on their faces. Then, just past midnight, they heard it, a faint, distant whistle. It was soft and melodic, drifting through the trees like a lonely tune carried on the wind. The friends froze, the hair on their necks standing on end. "You hear that?" Ben whispered, his eyes wide. "It's probably just someone else camping nearby," Mark said, though his voice wavered. The whistle continued, growing slightly louder, moving through the forest as if circling their campsite. It was an unsettling sound, like a song with no end, winding through the night in a way that felt almost purposeful. Lisa, determined to prove it was all nonsense, stood up and whistled back, imitating the tune. The others stared at her, horrified. "Lisa, don't," Jess hissed, grabbing her arm. But it was too late. The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence that pressed in on them from all sides. For a long moment, nothing happened. The friends sat in tense silence, waiting, straining to hear any noise. Then the whistle returned, closer this time, sharper, like it was right at the edge of their camp. "All right, very funny," Mark said, standing up and shining his flashlight into the trees. "Whoever's out there, you can knock it off." But the beam of his flashlight revealed nothing but empty woods. The whistling continued, weaving through the darkness, coming from all directions at once. It was impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from, and every time Mark turned it seemed to shift, always just out of sight. "We need to leave," Jess said, her voice trembling. "This isn't right." The group packed up hastily, extinguishing the fire and grabbing their gear. They decided to head back to their car, which was parked a couple of miles away at the trailhead. As they made their way through the forest, the whistling followed them, never too far behind. It was relentless, growing louder and more insistent, echoing through the trees in an unnatural, mocking tune. The trail seemed unfamiliar now, the darkness warping the path they had taken earlier. It felt like the forest was shifting around them, twisting the familiar into something sinister. The friends tried to stay calm, but panic was setting in. Mark led the way, his flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. "Keep moving," he urged, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every now and then he caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. A shadow darting between the trees, a figure just out of reach. They quickened their pace, but the whistling only grew closer, like it was right behind them. Then Ben tripped over a root and fell, cursing as he hit the ground. The group stopped to help him up, but when they did, the whistling stopped. They stood still, catching their breath, listening to the oppressive silence. "Maybe it's gone," Mark whispered, but his relief was short-lived. From the darkness ahead, just beyond the reach of their flashlights, a figure stepped into view. It was a man, dressed in tattered, outdated camping clothes, his face obscured by shadows. He stood motionless, staring at them with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. In his hand, he held an old, weathered whistle. The friends backed away slowly, fear gripping their chests. The figure raised the whistle to his lips and blew, the sound piercing the night like a knife. The tune was the same, but now it was deafening, echoing through the forest like 100 voices all whistling in unison. "Run!" Mark shouted, and they bolted, sprinting down the trail as fast as they could. The whistling chased them, relentless and unyielding, growing louder with every step. Jess stumbled, and when she looked back, the figure was right there, just a few feet away, his eyes locked onto hers. She screamed, scrambling to her feet and running blindly into the forest. The group splintered in their panic, each taking a different path in their desperate flight. The whistling continued, echoing through the woods, a constant, inescapable presence. Mark reached the trailhead first, gasping for breath as he stumbled into the parking lot. He fumbled with his keys, hands shaking as he unlocked the car and jumped inside. He honked the horn, trying to signal the others, but only silence greeted him. He waited, heart pounding, headlights illuminating the empty lot. Slowly, one by one, the others emerged from the trees, pale and shaken but alive. They piled into the car, slamming the doors and locking them. Mark floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the forest as fast as he could. The whistling had finally stopped, but the eerie tune still echoed in their minds, lingering like a bad dream. As they drove away, no one spoke, the tension thick and suffocating. It wasn't until they were miles away, back in the safety of the town, that they finally began to breathe again. They never spoke of that night, each haunted by the memory of the whistling and the figure in the woods. A few weeks later, Lisa was browsing through an old bookstore when she found a dusty, leather-bound journal tucked away on a high shelf. It was a collection of accounts from hikers and campers who had visited Pine Hollow over the years. She flipped through the pages, her heart skipping a beat when she found an entry about the Whistler. The author described an encounter eerily similar to their own, but what caught Lisa's attention was a faded photograph tucked between the pages. It showed a group of hikers from the 1970s, smiling at the camera with the familiar pine trees of Pine Hollow behind them. In the back row, just barely visible, was a figure she recognized instantly. A man in tattered clothes, his face shadowed, holding an old whistle. Lisa slammed the book shut, her heart racing. She glanced around the bookstore, half expecting to hear the faint sound of whistling, but there was only silence, heavy and thick, like the forest itself had followed her into the daylight. The whistler, it seemed, was not just a legend. He was real, bound to the forest, forever wandering the trails and waiting for the next group of campers to hear his call. And Lisa knew that no matter how far she went, the haunting melody would always be with her, echoing in the back of her mind, a constant reminder of the night they encountered the whistler in the woods. Hollow Creek was a small, quiet town surrounded by dense woods and winding rivers, a place where everyone knew each other, and nothing much ever happened. But over the years, the town had developed a chilling reputation. People would go missing. It started decades ago with hikers and campers who strayed too far into the forest and never returned. Then it was locals, farmers, hunters, even children, vanishing without a trace. The police would search, and volunteers would comb the woods, but no signs were ever found. The only clue, if it could be called that, was the strange, metallic sound that some claimed to hear before someone disappeared. A low, rhythmic thumping that echoed through the trees like a distant heartbeat. By the time Amy moved to Hollow Creek, the disappearances were mostly spoken of as cautionary tales. She had heard the stories but dismissed them as small-town legends meant to keep kids from wandering off. Amy had come to Hollow Creek to start fresh after a rough divorce, seeking the peace and simplicity of a quiet life. She opened a small cafe near the town square and quickly became a part of the close-knit community. But as much as she tried to fit in, Amy couldn't ignore the unease that lingered in the town. The locals were kind but guarded, always quick to change the subject whenever the topic of the missing people came up. It was as if they had accepted the vanishings as an inevitable part of life in Hollow Creek, like the change of seasons or the rising of the sun. One crisp autumn evening, Amy decided to close the cafe early and take a walk by the woods. The air was cool, the leaves rustling underfoot, as she strolled along the well-worn path that skirted the edge of the forest. She had always found the woods beautiful, a tangle of vibrant reds, oranges, and browns that seemed to stretch endlessly. But today, there was something off, an unsettling stillness, as if the forest were holding its breath. As Amy walked, she noticed something strange. The path seemed unfamiliar, despite having walked it many times before. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting into eerie shapes that blocked out the setting sun. A faint fog began to creep along the ground, swirling around her feet. She turned to head back, but the path behind her seemed to have changed, the way obscured by thick underbrush that hadn't been there moments ago. A low, rhythmic thumping sound reached her ears, faint but unmistakable, like a steady drumbeat echoing from deep within the woods. Amy paused, straining to hear. The sound was hypnotic, drawing her attention deeper into the forest. She shook her head, trying to clear the strange sense of disorientation that was setting in. She took a step back, determined to find her way out, but the thumping grew louder, almost demanding her to follow. Against her better judgment, Amy stepped off the path, moving toward the source of the sound. The forest around her seemed to shift with each step, the trees closing in as the fog thickened. The thumping was louder now, reverberating through the ground and into her bones. She couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It was as if the entire forest was alive with the sound, a deep, resonant pulse that drowned out all other noise. She stumbled forward, her heart racing as the trees gave way to a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its wood rotting and covered in moss. The windows were broken and the door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying gently with each thump. Amy hesitated, a chill running down her spine. The cabin looked ancient, out of place, as if it had been there for centuries, untouched and forgotten. The thumping sound was overwhelming now, emanating from the cabin with an almost magnetic pull. Amy felt her feet moving on their own, drawing her closer to the door. She reached out, pushing it open with a creak that echoed through the silent forest. Inside, the air was cold and damp, filled with the stench of decay. The thumping was deafening now, coming from beneath the floorboards, a rhythmic pounding that shook the entire structure. As Amy stepped inside, she noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols and runes carved deep into the wood, spiraling patterns that made her head spin if she looked at them for too long. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she approached the center of the room, where a trapdoor lay half open. The thumping was almost unbearable, louder and faster, resonating from the darkness below. Compelled by a force she couldn't understand, Amy pulled the trapdoor open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase descending into the earth. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But the thumping was all-consuming, drowning out her fear, urging her down into the darkness. She descended slowly, each step creaking under her weight, the air growing colder and more oppressive with every step. At the bottom, the thumping stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that pressed in on Amy from all sides. She fumbled for her flashlight, clicking it on to reveal a small, dirt-floored cellar. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old jars, each containing strange, unidentifiable objects floating in murky liquid. But what caught her attention was the far wall, where dozens of photographs were pinned, all yellowed with age. Amy's heart pounded as she approached the wall, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The photos were of people, men, women, children, all standing in front of the same cabin, their expressions vacant, eyes staring blankly at the camera. Amy's blood ran cold when she recognized some of the faces. They were the missing people from Hollow Creek, the ones who had vanished over the years, each one looking eerily unchanged, as if no time had passed since they were last seen. Her flashlight flickered, casting the room in brief moments of darkness. As she swung the beam back to the wall, she noticed a new photo had been added. It was of her, standing in front of the cabin, her expression blank and eyes lifeless. Amy staggered back, her breath hitching as she tried to process what she was seeing. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against her from all sides. Then she heard it, the faintest whisper, like a breath against her ear. Amy spun around, but the cellar was empty. The thumping resumed, louder and faster, echoing through the walls and floor. She bolted up the stairs, her flashlight flickering wildly, casting erratic shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. Bursting out of the cabin, Amy ran blindly through the forest, the thumping following her every step. The trees seemed to reach out, their branches clawing at her clothes and hair, slowing her down as the fog thickened. She ran until her lungs burned, until the thumping faded into the distance and the trees began to thin. She stumbled onto the main road, collapsing on the pavement as headlights from a passing car bathed her in light. The driver, a local man, helped her into his car, and she frantically told him what she had seen. He listened quietly, his face pale and eyes wide. "You shouldn't have gone into the woods," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Once you hear the thumping, it never stops." Amy left Hollow Creek the next day, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. She moved to a new town, changed her phone number, and tried to forget what had happened. But no matter how far she went, the thumping followed. At night, she would hear it faintly, a rhythmic pulse that grew louder when she was alone, echoing from the walls and floor of every new place she tried to call home. The disappearances in Hollow Creek never stopped. People continued to vanish, drawn by the same haunting thump that had nearly claimed Amy. She knew the cabin was still out there, hidden in the depths of the forest, waiting for the next person to wander too far off the path. The town continued on, its residents too afraid or too resigned to question the disappearances, and the legend of the thumping heartbeat of the woods lived on, whispered by those who dared to remember. Because once you heard the sound, you were never truly free. The forest had marked you, and no matter where you went, it was only a matter of time before it called you back into the darkness where the missing waited and the thumping never stopped. Sam Mitchell had been a long-haul truck driver for over 20 years, crisscrossing the country with his 18-wheeler, and hauling everything from electronics to frozen goods. He loved the open road, the solitude, and the freedom that came with his job. But there was one stretch of highway he hated more than any other, Route 89, a desolate road that cut through the heart of the Arizona desert. It was a lonely, eerie drive, especially at night when the vast expanse of desert stretched into darkness, and the only company was the occasional tumbleweed blowing across the asphalt. Route 89 was notorious among truckers for strange occurrences. Phantom headlights appearing in rear-view mirrors, disembodied voices crackling through the CB radio, and, most famously, the legend of the midnight hitchhiker. Stories varied, but every version included a lone hitchhiker standing by the side of the road at night, dressed in old-fashioned clothes and never seen in full light. Those who picked him up would find themselves alone moments later, with no sign of the hitchhiker anywhere, and others would see him vanish in the rearview mirror after refusing to stop. Most drivers brushed it off as a myth or the result of fatigue, but the stories persisted, passed along in hushed tones at truck stops and diners. One cold October night, Sam found himself hauling a load of produce through Arizona, and the dispatcher's route sent him straight down Route 89. He grumbled at the assignment, but had no choice. He knew the road well and had driven it dozens of times without incident, though he always felt uneasy whenever he passed the old, abandoned rest stop about halfway through the route. It was rumored to be the place where the midnight hitchhiker was often seen, standing in the shadows, waiting for a ride that never came. Sam set off from the last town just before midnight, hoping to make it through Route 89 without any issues. The first hour passed uneventfully. The road was empty, save for the occasional rabbit darting across the pavement. He listened to classic rock on the radio, sipping his coffee and keeping an eye on the clock. But as he approached the halfway mark, the road seemed to stretch longer, the darkness growing deeper and more oppressive. His headlights cut through the black night, illuminating the deserted road ahead. Just as he began to relax, Sam's radio flickered with static, interrupting the music. He fiddled with the dial, but the static only grew louder until a faint, crackling voice emerged from the noise, whispering something unintelligible. Sam frowned, tapping the radio in frustration, but the voice continued, growing clearer. "Pick me up," it whispered, the words sending a chill down his spine. Sam quickly switched off the radio, dismissing it as a signal from another trucker or a glitch in his equipment. But the eerie feeling lingered, settling into the pit of his stomach. He shook his head and focused on the road, telling himself it was nothing. As he approached the old rest stop, his truck's headlights illuminated a figure standing on the side of the road. Sam's heart skipped a beat. There, just outside the faint glow of his lights, was a man in a dark coat, his thumb out, face obscured by the shadows. Sam slowed down instinctively, squinting to get a better look, but the figure remained just out of reach like a blurred photograph. His clothes looked outdated, and he didn't seem to belong there like he had stepped out of another time. Sam remembered the stories and felt a jolt of fear. His instinct told him to keep driving, but something else, a strange, inexplicable pull, urged him to stop. As he passed the hitchhiker, he caught a glimpse in his side mirror. The man was staring straight at him, eyes glowing in the reflection like a predator's in the dark. Sam's blood ran cold. He slammed his foot on the gas, speeding away, heart pounding in his chest. For the next few miles, Sam kept glancing in his mirrors, half expecting to see the hitchhiker standing in the road behind him. But there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching into the darkness. He let out a shaky breath, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Just a trick of the light, he muttered to himself. Just my mind playing tricks. He tried to shake it off, but as he drove on, a strange feeling settled over him. It felt like he wasn't alone in the cab. He glanced over to the passenger seat, but it was empty. He checked the mirrors again and found nothing unusual, but the sensation persisted, a heavy, cold presence, like a breath on the back of his neck. The truck's temperature gauge suddenly plummeted, and a frigid chill filled the cab, fogging up the windows. Sam turned up the heat, but the cold remained, seeping into his bones. His breath misted in front of him, and he rubbed his arms, shivering uncontrollably. The lights on his dashboard flickered, and the radio crackled to life on its own, the static growing louder and more frantic. Then through the haze of static, Sam heard the voice again, clearer this time. "Pick me up." Sam's heart pounded as he reached to turn off the radio, but his hand froze mid-air. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the hitchhiker sitting in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. The man's face was pale and gaunt, eyes sunken and dark like he hadn't slept in years. His clothes were old, tattered, and drenched, as if he had been caught in a rainstorm that never ended. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the empty seat. Sam swerved, nearly losing control of the truck. He pulled over to the side of the road, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what he had seen. He scanned the cab, but he was alone. Shaking, he checked the mirrors again, half expecting to see the hitchhiker in the back of the truck, but there was nothing. "Get a grip, Sam," he muttered to himself, trying to steady his trembling hands. "It's just the stories getting to you." He took a moment to collect himself, then pulled back onto the road, keeping his eyes forward and trying to ignore the creeping dread that clung to him. But as he continued down Route 89, the radio crackled again, and the temperature dropped even further. Sam clenched the wheel, refusing to look to his right, even as the sensation of someone sitting beside him grew stronger. The radio voice returned, this time louder and more demanding. "You can't leave me here." Sam gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep driving. But suddenly, the headlights flickered and went out, plunging the truck into darkness. The engine sputtered, and the truck rolled to a stop, dead on the side of the road. Sam frantically tried to restart it, but the engine refused to turn over. Panic set in as he fumbled with the ignition, the cold seeping deeper into the cab. In the darkness, he heard the passenger door creak open and then footsteps, soft, wet footsteps like someone walking through mud. Sam didn't dare look, his hands shaking as he gripped the keys. The footsteps moved around the truck, slow and deliberate, like someone circling a prey. "Pick me up," the voice whispered, this time from right behind his ear. Sam screamed, turning to face the empty cab. The radio suddenly blared to life, blasting static and garbled voices, and the truck's lights flickered back on, illuminating the road ahead. Sam slammed his foot on the gas, the engine roaring to life, and the truck sped off down the highway. For the rest of the drive, Sam kept his eyes locked on the road, ignoring the occasional flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. The radio continued to sputter with static, but he kept it on, too afraid to touch it again. When he finally reached the next town, he pulled into a brightly lit truck stop, his hands still shaking. Sam parked the truck and jumped out, desperate for the warmth and light of the diner inside. As he entered, he caught sight of a group of truckers at the counter, exchanging stories. They looked up as he approached, their expressions turning to concern when they saw the look on his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," one of them said, sliding over to make room. "What happened?" Sam hesitated, glancing back at his truck, still half expecting to see the hitchhiker standing beside it. He sat down heavily, ordering a strong coffee before telling them everything. The truckers listened in silence, exchanging uneasy glances. "Midnight hitchhiker," one of them finally said, nodding knowingly. "You're not the first, but you're lucky, you know. Some don't make it out." Sam didn't respond, staring into his coffee. He knew he would never drive Route 89 again, no matter what. But deep down, he had a feeling the hitchhiker wasn't just a legend. Whatever was out there, it was real, and it was still waiting, somewhere in the darkness of that lonely desert highway. And as Sam climbed back into his truck to continue his journey, he couldn't shake the feeling that the midnight hitchhiker was still with him, just out of sight, waiting for the next opportunity to be picked up once more. Small towns have a way of keeping secrets. Mine was no different. Nestled in the shadow of the mountains, our town was a quiet, unremarkable place, the kind that people pass through without giving a second thought. It wasn't the sort of place where things happened, which made the disappearances all the more terrifying. It started with a young couple who went hiking in the woods one Sunday afternoon. They were locals, familiar with the trails, and planned to be back by dusk. But when night fell and they hadn't returned, the search parties were organized. Friends, family, and local volunteers combed through the woods with flashlights and dogs, calling their names. They found the couple's car at the trailhead, their jackets draped neatly over the seats, but of the couple there was no sign, not even a footprint. The search went on for weeks, but they never turned up. The town buzzed with rumors, and some people blamed the thick woods, known for their tricky terrain and sudden drops. Others whispered about wild animals, although no evidence supported that. As weeks turned into months, the town began to move on, the missing couple fading into another tragic story. Then, 2 months later, it happened again. A young man named Charlie, the son of the local diner owner, went missing. He was supposed to meet friends for a bonfire near the woods, but never showed up. His friends waited for him until midnight, assuming he'd just bailed, but the next morning his car was found at the same trailhead where the couple had disappeared. Doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of Charlie. Panic set in. The town was small and everyone knew everyone. We couldn't understand how people were just vanishing without a trace. Some said the woods were cursed, that they'd claimed the lost couple and now Charlie. Others believed it was the work of a serial killer hiding in the mountains. But there were no clues, no leads, nothing to suggest what was happening. I knew all the missing people. The couple, Amelia and Jared, had been in my grade. We'd grown up together, shared classrooms, played on the same fields. Charlie was my neighbor. I'd known him since we were kids. The disappearances weighed heavily on me, a gnawing dread that followed me everywhere. I started having nightmares about the woods, about getting lost and never finding my way out. The trees in my dreams were twisted and dark, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. One afternoon, a few weeks after Charlie disappeared, my friend Mark suggested we go to the woods. Just to look around, he said. Maybe there's something everyone missed. I was hesitant. The woods felt different now, like they were hiding something. But Mark was insistent. He'd been close with Charlie and couldn't accept that he'd just vanished. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. We packed flashlights, water, and our phones, and set off for the trailhead. The sun was setting when we arrived, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like grasping fingers. The trail was quiet, unnaturally so, and as we walked, the silence grew heavy. The deeper we went, the more the woods seemed to close in around us, the trees thickening, the path narrowing. We'd been walking for about an hour when Mark stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I listened, straining to hear. There was nothing at first, just the faint rustle of leaves. But then, slowly, I heard it. A soft rhythmic humming, like a distant melody carried on the wind. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the breeze, but it was there. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark shook his head, eyes scanning the trees. We followed the sound, veering off the main path and into the thicker part of the woods. The humming grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was beautiful but wrong, like a lullaby sung in reverse. We came to a clearing, a small patch of grass surrounded by towering trees. In the center stood a stone, old and weathered, covered in strange carvings that I couldn't make out. The humming was louder here, almost vibrating in my bones. I glanced at Mark, but he was staring at the stone, transfixed. "What is this place?" I asked. But Mark didn't respond. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if drawn by an invisible force. I reached out to grab his arm, but something stopped me. An overwhelming sense of dread, like I was standing at the edge of a precipice. Mark placed his hand on the stone, and the humming stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Mark turned to me, his eyes wide. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice shaking. I nodded, but I didn't know what I'd felt, just that it was wrong. We decided to head back, the silence weighing on us like a heavy blanket. As we walked, the woods seemed different, darker, the trees pressing in closer. We should have been back to the trailhead in 20 minutes, but the path seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't recognize. Mark pulled out his phone, but there was no signal, just static. The battery, full when we'd left, drained to nothing in seconds. Panic set in as we realized we were lost. We tried to retrace our steps, but the trees all looked the same, and the path was gone. We were trapped in a maze of branches and shadows. The humming started again, faint but insistent, coming from all directions. It felt like the woods were alive, shifting and watching, pulling us deeper. "Stay close," Mark said, his voice tight with fear. We stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find any sign of the trail. The humming grew louder, more frantic, and the trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like claws. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and that's when I saw it. A piece of fabric caught on a branch, fluttering in the breeze. It was blue, the same shade as the shirt Charlie had been wearing the last time anyone saw him. I grabbed it, my heart racing. "Mark," I called, but he was gone. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was no sign of him. Just the trees, looming and silent. The humming was deafening now, vibrating through the ground, through my bones. I ran, calling his name, but the woods swallowed my voice. I don't remember how long I ran or when I finally stumbled out of the woods and into the parking lot. The sun was rising and I was alone. Mark was gone, vanished without a trace, just like the others. I collapsed by my car, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. I'd gone into the woods with my best friend, and now I was alone. I reported what happened, but no one believed me. The authorities organized another search, but they found nothing. No stone, no carvings, no trace of Mark or the others. Just empty woods and silent trees. They told me I must have gotten lost, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. The disappearances never stopped. People continued to go missing. Hikers, campers, even seasoned hunters who knew the woods better than anyone. They all vanished, leaving behind their cars and gear, as if they'd never been there at all. The town tried to close the trails, but it didn't matter. The woods didn't care about boundaries or signs. They took who they wanted. I moved away a few months after Mark disappeared. I couldn't stand being so close to those woods, to the place that had swallowed my friends and neighbors. But the nightmares followed me. I still hear the humming sometimes, faint and far away, like a memory I can't quite reach. I've read stories of cursed places, of haunted woods that trap the lost and never let them go. I used to think they were just that, stories. But now I know the truth. Some places are hungry, waiting for the unwary to stumble in, and once you're in, you never get out. Because the woods remember. They remember every step, every breath, every lost soul that passes through, and they never let you go. Being a long-haul truck driver can get pretty lonely. The hours stretch into days, the roads blur into an endless ribbon of asphalt, and the only company you've got is the faint hum of the radio and the occasional crackle of CB chatter. I'd been driving trucks for over 15 years and I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night on Route 68. I was on a late-night run, hauling a load of machinery through a desolate stretch of desert highway. It was around 2 a.m., the darkest part of the night when the road seemed to stretch on forever into the inky blackness. I'd been driving for hours without seeing another vehicle, and my eyelids were getting heavy. I cranked up the radio, hoping some classic rock would keep me awake, but the signal faded in and out, leaving me with nothing but static. Just as I was considering pulling over for a quick nap, I spotted something up ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road, barely illuminated by my headlights. A hitchhiker, his thumb out, motioning for a ride. I could see he was wearing a faded plaid shirt and jeans, his hair a mess of dark curls. Not exactly the type you'd expect to be out here in the middle of nowhere. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's against company policy and you never know who you might end up with. But something about this guy seemed different. He looked young, maybe early 20s, and there was a look in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. Desperation, maybe. I slowed down, rolling the window down slightly. "You need a lift?" I called out, keeping one hand on the wheel. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, thanks, just need to get down the road." I hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the door. He climbed in, settling into the passenger seat without saying much. As I started to pull back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. But it was late, and the thought of leaving him out there alone didn't sit right with me. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the occasional pop of gravel under the tires. He stared straight ahead, barely moving, his hands resting on his knees. I tried to make small talk, asking where he was headed and what had brought him out here, but his answers were short, almost robotic. "Just passing through," he said, his voice flat and distant. "Trying to get home." "Where's home?" I asked, glancing over at him. But he didn't answer, just kept staring out the windshield, his eyes unfocused. After a few more minutes of awkward silence, I decided to leave him be. We drove on, the road stretching endlessly before us. I was starting to feel uneasy, a prickling sensation crawling up the back of my neck. I kept sneaking glances at him, trying to figure out what was off. There was something unsettling about the way he sat there, perfectly still, like he was just waiting. Then out of nowhere he spoke. "You ever hear about the hitchhiker who never makes it home?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned, caught off guard. "Can't say that I have." He turned to look at me, and for the first time I noticed how pale he was, like all the color had drained from his face. His eyes were dark, sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. "They say he's been out here for years," he continued, his gaze locked onto mine. "Always trying to get home, but he never does. People pick him up, try to help, but he's never seen again." A chill ran down my spine. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping unease. "Sounds like one of those urban legends. You can't believe everything you hear." He didn't respond, just turned his attention back to the road. We drove on in silence, the tension in the cab growing thicker with every mile. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 3:13 a.m., the witching hour, just my luck. As we passed under a flickering streetlight, I stole another glance at him. For a split second, I thought I saw something move on his face, shadows twisting, his features warping into something else. But it was gone as quickly as it came, leaving me questioning whether I'd seen anything at all. "You okay, man?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't answer. He just kept staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white. The road seemed darker now, the headlights barely piercing through the night. I flicked on the high beams, hoping for some comfort in the extra light, but it only seemed to deepen the shadows. Then out of nowhere he whispered again, so softly I almost didn't hear it. "They never see him again." I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. The truck skidded to a halt, tires screeching against the asphalt. I turned to confront him, but the passenger seat was empty. My breath hitched as I scanned the cab, my eyes wide. The door was still locked, and there was no way he could have gotten out without me noticing. He was just gone. I jumped out of the truck, my flashlight in hand, and shined it into the darkness. Nothing. Just the empty road stretching endlessly in both directions. I circled the truck, shining the light into the shadows, calling out, but there was no trace of him. It was like he'd never been there at all. I got back into the truck, my hands shaking as I locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, but the silence was deafening. I cranked the engine and sped down the highway, the tires kicking up dust and gravel. I didn't care about the speed limits or the company policy. I just needed to get out of there. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until the sun was rising, bathing the road in a pale, forgiving light. I pulled into a truck stop, parked the rig, and stumbled into the diner, my legs weak. I ordered a coffee, trying to calm my nerves. The waitress must have noticed my pale face because she asked if I was okay. "Yeah," I lied, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "Just a rough night." I didn't tell her about the hitchhiker or how he'd vanished right in front of me. I didn't mention the whispering or the way the road had seemed to swallow him whole. I just sat there, staring at the reflection in the diner's window, half expecting to see him standing behind me. A few hours later, I was back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw movement, just a flicker, like someone was sitting in the back of the cab. But every time I looked closer, there was nothing there. I made it to my delivery point, unloaded the cargo, and headed back, sticking to the main highways this time. I never took Route 68 again, and I never picked up another hitchhiker. But sometimes, late at night when the road is dark and the radio is just static, I hear it again, that faint whisper, like a breath on the back of my neck. They never see him again. And I know deep down that he's still out there, still trying to get home. And now, he's watching me, waiting for the right moment to catch another ride. I've been an avid camper my whole life. I love the outdoors, the fresh air, the freedom, the feeling of being miles away from civilization. There's nothing quite like it. So, when my friends canceled last minute on our camping trip to Devil's Hollow, I decided to go alone. I had camped solo plenty of times before, and I wasn't about to let a little isolation stop me from enjoying a weekend in the wilderness. Devil's Hollow had a reputation among locals. Some called it haunted, others just said it had bad energy. But to me, it was just another spot on the map, a dense stretch of forest with some great trails and plenty of seclusion. Perfect for a weekend getaway. I packed my gear, drove up to the trailhead, and set off into the woods. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, crisp air, and the kind of quiet that only a deep forest can offer. As I hiked deeper into the hollow, I noticed the trees grew thicker, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting strange shadows on the forest floor. After a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a view of the distant mountains. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for a relaxing evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker, the shadows stretching longer and deeper. I lit a fire and sat by it, enjoying the solitude. The sounds of the forest were comforting at first, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But as the night wore on, I noticed something strange. The forest was getting too quiet. The crickets stopped, the wind died down, and the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper, carried on the wind. It was so faint that I almost missed it, like a voice just at the edge of hearing. I turned my head, scanning the dark trees, but saw nothing. The whisper faded, and I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks. I tried to focus on the fire, poking at the embers to keep it going, but the whispering started again, this time closer. I strained to listen, my skin prickling with unease. It wasn't a single voice, but a low murmur, like multiple voices blending together, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. I couldn't make out any words, but the sound sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing out there, just trees and shadows. I called out, half expecting to see another camper or maybe a couple of hikers, but my voice echoed back to me, unanswered. I sat back down, telling myself to stay calm. It was probably just the forest settling, maybe animals moving in the underbrush. I'd heard strange noises in the woods before, and they'd never been anything to worry about. But the whispering continued, and now it sounded like it was coming from all around me, circling the campsite. I decided to stoke the fire higher, the flames pushing back the darkness. For a moment, the whispering stopped, replaced by the crackling of the fire and the snap of burning wood. I felt a brief sense of relief, but it was short-lived. As I sat there staring into the flames, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, my flashlight sweeping across the trees, and froze. For a split second, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone, as if it had never been there. My heart raced, my mind struggling to rationalize what I'd just seen. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer, just the oppressive silence of the woods. I backed up closer to the fire, the only source of comfort in the encroaching darkness. I could feel my pulse in my ears, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. I scanned the tree line, my flashlight darting back and forth, but the figure was gone. I sat down, trying to keep my breathing steady, my eyes glued to the surrounding woods. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It felt like it was coming from right behind me, but every time I turned, there was nothing, just the dark, empty forest. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I doused the fire, packed my gear in record time, and grabbed my flashlight, ready to leave. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night or that hiking out in the dark was risky. I just needed to get out of those woods. As I started down the trail, the whispering followed me, growing louder with every step. It wasn't just behind me anymore. It was in my ears, surrounding me, drowning out my thoughts. I could feel the weight of eyes on my back, like I was being watched from every direction. I walked faster, my flashlight beam bouncing erratically, the path barely visible under the pale moonlight. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind racing. I could hear footsteps now, soft, shuffling, like someone dragging their feet just behind me. I refused to look back. I just kept moving, hoping to reach the trailhead before whatever was out there caught up with me. Suddenly the path split, and I realized I didn't recognize where I was. My heart sank as I shined the flashlight around, trying to find the markers I'd seen earlier, but there were none. I had no idea how I'd gotten turned around, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I picked a direction and kept going, hoping it was the right way. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could feel the whispering vibrating through my bones. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was inside me, filling my head, overwhelming my senses. I stumbled, falling to my knees, the flashlight slipping from my grip and rolling away. I scrambled after it, my fingers brushing the cold dirt, and that's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the trees, their outlines barely visible in the dim light. There were at least half a dozen, all tall and thin, their faces hidden in shadow. They moved slowly, almost gliding, their feet never seeming to touch the ground. The whispering grew deafening, and I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head now, a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs that made my skull feel like it was splitting open. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it at them, but the beam flickered and died. I was left in total darkness, surrounded by the figures, their shapes closing in, blocking out the sky. I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder, and a chill shot through my entire body. I bolted, running blindly through the forest, branches slashing at my face and arms. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst through the trees and onto the main road. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop until I saw my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and hit the gas, speeding away from Devil's Hollow as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if those figures were still there, watching me from the edge of the woods. I just drove, not stopping until I was miles away, the sun starting to rise on the horizon. I never went back to Devil's Hollow. I've tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that maybe it was some combination of exhaustion, fear, and the eerie silence of the forest. But deep down, I know what I saw. I felt it. And I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone and the world is quiet. If you ever find yourself near Devil's Hollow, do yourself a favor. Stay on the main trails and don't camp alone. Because once the forest has its eyes on you, it never really lets you go. And whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers. I've been a truck driver for over 15 years, and I've seen just about everything the highways of America can throw at you. Road rage, crazy weather, and some of the most bizarre sights you can imagine. But nothing compares to what happened that night on Route 93. It's a stretch of road I'll never drive again. It was supposed to be a routine haul, late-night delivery, heading through Nevada's barren desert. Just me and my rig. The job was straightforward. Pick up a load in Reno, drop it off in Phoenix. I'd done the road a dozen times before, but this night was different. The weather was clear, and the moon hung low, casting a pale light over the desolate landscape. Everything was going smoothly until my GPS started acting up. 1 minute, it was guiding me along the usual route, and the next, it went blank. Just a black screen with no signal. I pulled over, messing with the settings, trying to get it to reboot, but it was dead. I figured it was just a glitch. It happens. I knew the general direction, so I decided to keep going until I could get a better signal. The road was empty, not another vehicle in sight, just miles of desert stretching out on either side, flat and featureless. After a while, I noticed something strange, a flickering light in my side mirror, like headlights bouncing on the horizon. At first, I thought it was another truck catching up, but the light kept flickering, erratic and inconsistent. I slowed down, checking my mirrors, but there was nothing behind me, just darkness. I brushed it off as a trick of the eyes. Maybe I was just tired. It had been a long day, and the solitude was starting to get to me. But as I kept driving, the flickering light appeared again, this time on the other side, like it was moving around me. I glanced out the window, but all I saw was my reflection in the empty desert. No cars, no signs of life. I sped up, telling myself to shake it off, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Then I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road, just barely illuminated by my headlights. It was tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old, tattered coat. I slowed down instinctively, my first thought being that maybe it was someone stranded out here in the middle of nowhere. But as I got closer, something felt off. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the blinding light of my truck. No, I could only make out the shape, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its arms hung too long at its sides, almost touching the ground. I couldn't see a face, just darkness where the head should have been. I hit the gas, speeding past it, my eyes glued to the road ahead. I didn't want to look back, but my curiosity got the best of me. I glanced in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the figure shrinking in the distance, but it wasn't there. Instead, it was closer, much closer. I nearly swerved off the road, my heart racing. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching, and my truck skidded to a stop. I looked around, trying to spot the figure, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching back the way I'd come. The desert was still, the only sound the faint hum of my engine. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm down, chalking it up to exhaustion and the tricks the desert plays on your eyes at night. I put the truck back in gear and pulled back onto the road, telling myself it was just a shadow, maybe a broken down sign or a weirdly shaped cactus. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The flickering light was back, darting around my mirrors, always just at the edge of my vision. I turned on my high beams, hoping to cut through the darkness, but it didn't help. The light kept moving, erratic and unnatural. After what felt like hours, I saw a dim glow in the distance, an old, run-down gas station that I recognized as a landmark. I decided to pull in, take a break, and get my bearings. As I approached, the lights of the gas station flickered, struggling to stay on, casting an eerie, yellow glow over the cracked pavement. I parked by the pump and got out, stretching my legs. The station was empty, no other cars, no sign of an attendant. Just an old, flickering neon sign buzzing faintly. I walked up to the door, hoping to find a map or something to help me get back on track. That's when I saw it again, the figure standing at the edge of the station's light, just beyond the reach of the glow. It was closer now, clearer. I could see its outline, a tall, gaunt silhouette with that same twisted posture, head still tilted at that unnatural angle. Its eyes, if it had any, were hidden in the shadows, but I could feel it watching me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the door, yanking it open and stumbling inside. The station was empty, just rows of dusty shelves and a long-dead radio playing faint static. I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I glanced out the window, but the figure was gone. I told myself I needed sleep, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just exhaustion, and it wasn't a mirage. I paid for the water at a decrepit self-service kiosk and hurried back to my truck, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The gas station's lights flickered as I pulled away, plunging the place into darkness behind me. I floored it, speeding down the highway, my eyes darting between the road and my mirrors. The flickering light was still there, dancing around me, but I refused to look directly at it. I just kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. After a while, I saw a sign for a rest stop and veered off, desperate for any sign of normalcy. The rest stop was deserted. Just a couple of old picnic tables and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, but I was too tired to care. I parked and shut off the engine, finally allowing myself to breathe. As I sat there, I heard a faint tapping, a soft, rhythmic sound coming from the back of the truck. I froze, listening. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and climbed out, walking around to the rear of the truck. The tapping continued, a steady beat that echoed in the still night air. I hesitated, then yanked open the cargo doors. The tapping stopped, and I shined the flashlight inside. My cargo was intact, everything strapped down, nothing out of place. I stood there, breathing heavily, the flashlight beam dancing over the crates and boxes. Then I saw it, a small crumpled piece of paper lying on the floor, right in the center of the truck. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was a receipt from the gas station, dated from years ago, with a single line scribbled on the back in messy, almost childlike handwriting. You can't outrun what you can't see. I dropped the paper and backed away, slamming the doors shut. I jumped back into the cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I drove through the night, the whisper of that tapping sound still echoing in my ears. The flickering light never left my mirrors, and every time I checked, I half expected to see that figure standing in the road, closer and closer. I finally reached a small town just before dawn, my nerves frayed and my body running on adrenaline. I pulled into a diner, the first sign of life I'd seen in hours, and slumped into a booth, exhausted and shaken. When the waitress came over, I asked if she knew anything about Route 93. She gave me a strange look and said, "You're lucky you made it out. That stretch of road's got a bad history. Truckers go missing there. They say the desert takes them." I didn't tell her what I'd seen. I didn't think she'd believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. But I know this. Whatever's out there on Route 93, it's real. It's watching, waiting, and it's always just one step behind. If you're ever out on that highway and you see a flickering light in your mirror, don't slow down. Don't stop. And whatever you do, don't look back. Because once it finds you, it won't let go. I've been a detective for over 15 years, and I've seen my share of strange cases. But nothing could have prepared me for the string of disappearances that gripped our small town last year. We're not a big city, just a quiet place where everyone knows everyone, and crime is usually limited to petty thefts and the occasional bar fight. So when people started vanishing without a trace, it sent shockwaves through the community. It started with a local teenager, Sarah Miller. She was a straight-A student, responsible, no history of running away. She left her house one evening to meet some friends at the movies and never showed up. No one saw her after that, no witnesses, no CCTV footage, nothing. Her parents were devastated, and the town rallied to search for her, combing every inch of the surrounding woods and fields, but it was like she'd vanished into thin air. A week later, another person disappeared. A young man named Kevin who worked at the local hardware store. Same story. Went out for a jog one morning and never came back. The search parties grew larger, and the rumors started to spread. People whispered about everything from serial killers to alien abductions, but there was no evidence, no leads, just empty places where people used to be. By the time the fifth person went missing, a middle-aged woman named Nancy who was last seen leaving the grocery store, panic had set in. People stopped going out after dark. The streets, once busy with kids playing and neighbors chatting, grew quiet and deserted. The fear was palpable, a living thing that hung over the town like a dark cloud. I was assigned to the case, along with my partner Mike. We were working around the clock, following every lead, interviewing everyone who had seen the missing people. But no matter how hard we looked, we always ended up at the same dead end. It was like they had just ceased to exist. We didn't even have any bodies to confirm our worst fears. The pressure was mounting, not just from the families, but from the town itself. We were running out of time and options. That's when we got a call from an old man named Harold, who lived on the outskirts of town near the woods. He was a bit of a recluse, known for his odd habits and conspiracy theories, but he was adamant that he had information about the disappearances. Mike and I drove out to his place, a rundown cabin that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The windows were boarded up and the yard was overgrown with weeds. Harold met us at the door, his eyes wild and jittery like he hadn't slept in days. "You're here about the missing people, right?" he asked, glancing nervously over his shoulder. We nodded and he ushered us inside, locking the door behind us with 3 different bolts. "You think I'm crazy," he said, pacing the small living room. "Everyone does. But I've seen it. I've seen what's taking them." Mike and I exchanged a look. We'd dealt with enough false leads to be skeptical, but Harold was clearly convinced he had something important to share. "What did you see, Harold?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He paused, wringing his hands. "It's the woods," he said finally. "They're wrong. They're hungry." He led us to the back of the cabin and pulled aside a heavy curtain, revealing a wall covered in maps, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Red string connected pins that formed a chaotic web across the maps. At the center was a cluster of points, all near the woods. "It's a pattern," Harold said, jabbing a finger at the map. "All the disappearances are happening near the old trail. But it's not just people walking into the woods and getting lost, it's something else." I looked closer at the maps. Harold had marked the locations of each disappearance, and he was right. They were all clustered around the same area. But there was something else, too, something that sent a chill down my spine. The disappearances formed a perfect circle. "It's a doorway," Harold whispered. "A doorway to somewhere else." Mike rolled his eyes, but I felt a creeping unease settle in my stomach. Harold's theory was outlandish, sure, but I'd been in this town long enough to know that sometimes the most unbelievable stories had a grain of truth. "We've got to see it," I said, grabbing my coat. "We need to check out the trail." Mike was reluctant, but we agreed to go in the daylight, hoping that a thorough search might turn up something we'd missed. Harold insisted on coming along, muttering about showing us the right path. The next morning we headed to the trail, a narrow, overgrown path that twisted through the dense woods. Harold led the way, his gait erratic but purposeful, like he was following some invisible guide. The further we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural silence that pressed in from all sides. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Harold stopped abruptly at a small clearing. It was unremarkable, just a circle of trees with a few rocks scattered around. But the air was colder here, and the shadows felt darker, like they were hiding something just out of sight. "This is it," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it happens." Mike looked around, frowning. "It's just a clearing, Harold." But I felt it. The wrongness, the sense that we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't understand. I took a step forward and the ground seemed to shift beneath me, like stepping onto the surface of a lake. The air rippled, and I swore I saw the trees bend inward, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. "Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice tight. Mike opened his mouth to respond, but his words were cut off by a sudden gust of wind that whipped through the clearing, cold and sharp. It carried a faint, distant sound, like whispering, just on the edge of hearing. Before I could react, Harold let out a panicked shout. "Get back, it's opening!" The ground beneath us began to tremble, and the air grew thick with the sound of whispers. The trees swayed violently, their branches creaking like old bones. I grabbed Mikey's arm, pulling him back, but it was too late. The clearing seemed to fold in on itself, the trees blurring and twisting until they were nothing more than dark, swirling shapes. I stumbled back, dragging Mike with me, and the ground steadied. The whispers faded, and the trees stood still once more. Harold was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with terror. "Do you see now?" he gasped. "It's not just a place, it's a thing, it's alive." We left the woods in a hurry, none of us saying a word. I couldn't explain what we'd seen, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. Back at the station, we wrote up our reports. But what could we say? That the woods were swallowing people whole? That there was a doorway to somewhere else, hidden among the trees? The official story was that the missing were presumed dead, lost to the elements or perhaps to some unknown predator. But the truth was something we couldn't put on paper. Mike and I both left the force not long after that, the weight of the unsolved cases too heavy to bear. Harold moved away, saying he couldn't stand to be near the woods anymore. The disappearances stopped, but the town was never the same. People still talk about it, the ones who remember. They say you can hear the whispers if you get too close to the old trail, and that sometimes, on quiet nights, the trees seem to move on their own. I don't go near the woods anymore. I stay in the town where the lights are bright and the streets are busy. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that clearing and the way the air rippled, like the surface of water. And I wonder what's on the other side of that doorway, waiting in the dark. So if you ever find yourself near Whispering Pines and you feel the ground shift beneath you, turn around and leave. Some places are hungry, and once they've seen you, they never forget. A couple of months ago, my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip deep in the Whispering Pines forest. It was supposed to be a weekend of hiking, fishing, and just getting away from our busy lives. The place was remote, known for its dense woods and secluded beauty, and it had no cell service. A perfect getaway, or so we thought. There were 5 of us, me, Tom, Sarah, Jess, and Mike. We'd all been friends since college. And though our lives had gotten busy with work and other responsibilities, we tried to keep up the tradition of an annual camping trip. This year, Tom suggested Whispering Pines, a place none of us had been to, but that he had read about on some hiking forum. The name alone sounded peaceful and inviting. We packed our gear and headed out on a Friday afternoon. The drive took longer than expected, winding through back roads that grew narrower and less maintained the deeper we went. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the towering pines. We hiked for about an hour before finding a suitable clearing to set up camp. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to muffle the outside world. We set up our tents, started a fire, and spent the evening drinking, laughing, and catching up under the stars. It was perfect, or at least it started out that way. Later that night, as we sat around the fire, Sarah mentioned something she had read online. Whispering Pines had a reputation among locals for being haunted. She laughed it off as a silly legend, but the rest of us wanted to hear more. Apparently, the forest was once home to a small village that had vanished without a trace about 100 years ago. The villagers were said to have all disappeared overnight, leaving everything behind. Their homes, their belongings, everything was intact, but the people were gone. Over time, the forest reclaimed the land, and the village became nothing more than a legend, swallowed up by the trees. Jess shivered and threw another log on the fire. "Creepy," she said, glancing over her shoulder at the dark forest. We all laughed, trying to shake off the chill that had settled over us. Tom joked about searching for the lost village in the morning, but we all agreed we'd stick to the marked trails. That night I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a distant hum, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. I lay still, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, taking on a rhythmic, almost melodic tone. It was like singing, low and soft, drifting through the trees. I unzipped my tent and peered out. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint light around the campsite. The others were still asleep, their tents motionless. I listened intently, trying to locate the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing through the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, scanning the trees. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the cool night air, before convincing myself it was just my imagination. I climbed back into my tent, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that something was off. The next morning I asked if anyone else had heard the singing, but they all shook their heads. Mike laughed and said I was just spooked by Sarah's ghost story. We spent the day hiking and exploring, sticking to the trails as planned. It was beautiful out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Just shadows, I told myself. But it was enough to keep my nerves on edge. That night, we decided to turn in early, exhausted from the long day. I fell asleep quickly, but it didn't last. Once again, I woke up in the middle of the night, this time to the sound of whispering. It was closer than before, just outside my tent, like someone was crouched right by the flap. My heart raced as I listened, straining to make out the words. It was a hushed, frantic whispering, like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping and tangled. I lay there, too afraid to move, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching softly on the pine needles. They circled the campsite, pausing in front of each tent, then moving on to the next. I clutched my flashlight, waiting for the steps to stop at mine, but they never did. They just faded away into the trees, leaving me alone with my pounding heart. In the morning, I wasn't the only one looking worse for wear. Sarah and Tom both mentioned having strange dreams, and Jess swore she'd seen figures moving in the woods just before dawn. Mike laughed it off, trying to lighten the mood, but there was an undercurrent of unease that none of us could shake. By the third night, the tension was palpable. We stuck close to the fire, talking less and jumping at every little sound. The forest seemed darker, more oppressive, the trees pressing in on us like silent sentinels. The whispering started early, drifting through the trees long before we turned in. This time, everyone heard it. It was impossible to ignore. Dozens of voices murmuring in a language none of us could understand, growing louder and more insistent. We decided to sleep in shifts, keeping the fire burning bright. I took the first watch, sitting by the fire with a flashlight in one hand and a hatchet in the other. The whispering never stopped, just hovered at the edge of hearing, like it was waiting for us to make a move. Around midnight, Jess came to relieve me. I crawled into my tent, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chin, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, staring at the tent's ceiling, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the relentless whispering that seemed to seep into my bones. And then I heard it, the zipper of a tent slowly being pulled open. I sat up, peering out to see who it was, but everyone's tents were closed. The fire had burned down to embers again, and Jess was nowhere in sight. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the campsite. There was no sign of her. "Jess," I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response, just the whispering, growing louder, more urgent. The others started waking up, groggy and confused. We called Jess's name over and over, but there was nothing but the whispers, now almost a chorus, chanting softly through the trees. Tom and I grabbed our flashlights and headed into the woods, following the faint trail of broken branches and disturbed leaves. The whispering seemed to follow us, wrapping around us like a cold fog. We called her name again and again, but it was like the forest was swallowing our voices. After what felt like hours, we found her. She was standing in the middle of a small, circular clearing, surrounded by ancient, twisted trees. She was facing away from us, her head tilted up as if listening to something we couldn't hear. Her skin was pale, and her eyes were wide and unfocused, like she was in a trance. "Jess!" Tom shouted, running toward her, but as soon as he stepped into the clearing, the whispering stopped. Jess slowly turned to face us, and I felt my stomach drop. Her eyes were completely black, as if the pupils had swallowed the irises, and her mouth was moving silently like she was still whispering, even though no sound came out. Tom reached out to grab her, but as soon as his hand touched her shoulder, the forest erupted in a deafening roar. The trees shook, their branches creaking and groaning like they were alive. We stumbled back, pulling Jess with us, and ran, not stopping until we were back at camp. We packed up in a frantic rush, leaving most of our gear behind. Jess didn't say a word, just stared blankly ahead, her eyes still that unnatural black. We hiked out of the forest as fast as we could, the whispering following us every step of the way. It wasn't until we crossed the threshold back onto the main road that it finally stopped. We never talked about what happened that night. Jess didn't come back to herself until days later, and even then she refused to speak about it. We all went our separate ways, trying to forget, but some things you can't unhear. I haven't been camping since, and whenever I drive past the sign for Whispering Pines, I feel a shiver run down my spine. There are places in this world that don't belong to us, places where the trees have seen too much and the ground remembers. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and you hear the whispering start, don't listen. And whatever you do, don't look back. I've been a long-haul truck driver for over 20 years, and I've seen it all, the weird, the wonderful, and the downright terrifying. The highways can be lonely places, especially on those late-night drives when it feels like you're the only soul left in the world. But I always loved the solitude, the hum of the engine, the miles stretching out in front of me. That was until one night, on a deserted stretch of Highway 89, when I picked up a hitchhiker. I was hauling a load of steel pipes from Nevada to Wyoming, and it was pushing 2 a.m. when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, just outside the reach of my headlights, her thumb out and her other hand gripping a small backpack. Normally, I wouldn't stop. Company policy, you know, too many risks. But there was something about her, a young woman, all alone in the middle of nowhere, that made me pull over. I rolled down the window and asked where she was headed. She stepped into the light and I got my first good look at her. She couldn't have been more than 20, with long, tangled hair and dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. She was pale, her clothes dirty and torn, like she'd been on the road for a while. "Just up the road," she said, her voice quiet and strained. She didn't offer any more details, and I didn't press. I figured I'd drop her off at the next truck stop, maybe buy her a coffee. I unlocked the door and she climbed in, settling into the passenger seat without a word. We rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the low rumble of the engine and the occasional creak of the truck's frame. I glanced over at her a few times, but she just stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the road. There was a tension in the cab, like the air was thick with something unsaid. I tried to break the silence, asking where she was from, but she just shrugged and mumbled something I couldn't make out. After a few miles, she finally spoke up. "You should be careful on this road." I glanced at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She didn't look at me, her gaze still locked on the highway. "Bad things happen out here, people go missing." A chill ran down my spine. There were all sorts of stories about this stretch of highway, disappearances, accidents, unsolved murders, but most of it was just talk. Urban legends passed around by truckers to keep themselves entertained on long drives. I'd never put much stock in it. "Yeah, I've heard the stories," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "But I've been driving this route for years. Nothing's ever happened to me." She turned to look at me then, and her eyes were different, darker, emptier, like she was seeing right through me. "Not yet." I laughed it off, but there was no humor in it. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. I tried to shake the feeling, focusing on the road, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. It was like the night had gotten darker, the shadows deeper. The headlights barely seemed to cut through the gloom, and the road stretched out endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that didn't seem right. After a while, the girl spoke again. "There's a rest stop up ahead. You should pull over." I didn't remember there being a rest stop on this stretch, but I nodded, grateful for a reason to break the tension. As we rounded a bend, I saw it. A small, run-down rest area with a single flickering light. It looked abandoned, the kind of place that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. But it was there, just off the highway, like it had been waiting for us. I pulled in and killed the engine. The silence that followed was oppressive, like the night itself was holding its breath. The girl got out without a word, and I followed, feeling an inexplicable need to keep her in sight. She walked toward the restroom building, her steps slow and deliberate. I stayed by the truck, leaning against the cab and lighting a cigarette to steady my nerves. As I watched her, a strange feeling came over me, a sense that something was terribly wrong. The rest area was too quiet, too still. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just an eerie, unnatural silence that set my teeth on edge. I glanced around, but there was no sign of life, no other vehicles, nothing but the dim glow of the flickering light. Then I noticed the graffiti. It was scrawled all over the walls of the restroom building, faded and barely legible in the dim light. But one word stood out, repeated over and over. "Don't look back." My heart rate spiked. I called out to the girl, but there was no response. I took a step toward the building, the urge to leave warring with my sense of responsibility. I didn't want to abandon her, but every instinct screamed at me to get back in the truck and drive. I was about to take another step when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from behind me. I turned slowly, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the truck's headlights, I saw a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. It was standing perfectly still, just watching. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of its body, dark and featureless against the night. I took a step back, and it mirrored me, moving in that same jerky, unsettling way. Panic surged through me. I spun around to call for the girl again, but she was gone. The restroom was empty, the door hanging open and swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. The shuffling sound grew louder, closer. I whipped back around, but the figure was gone. I scanned the darkness, my pulse racing, but there was nothing, just the empty rest area and the flickering light. I backed toward the truck, my hands fumbling for the door handle. I needed to get out of there. Now. As I climbed into the cab and slammed the door, I caught a glimpse of something in the side mirror. A face, pale, hollow-eyed, peering in from the shadows. I jerked the wheel, the truck lurching forward as I floored the gas. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just drove, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, my eyes locked on the road. It wasn't until I was miles away that I dared to slow down. I pulled into a well-lit truck stop, my hands still shaking as I parked and turned off the engine. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning I asked around about the rest stop, but no one knew what I was talking about. The other drivers just shrugged, saying there was no rest area on that stretch of Highway 89. I even checked the maps and GPS, but there was nothing. It was like the place didn't exist. I've taken different routes ever since. I still drive at night, still find comfort in the solitude of the road. But every now and then, when the highway is empty and the night is too quiet, I catch myself glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see that figure watching from the shadows. And sometimes late at night, I think about the girl and what she said. Bad things happen out here. People go missing. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore, not after that night. Not after I realized that some roads lead to places that shouldn't exist, and some passengers are never meant to be found. I took a job as a night security guard at Maplewood High School, a sprawling campus with a dark history. The school had been built in the early 1900s, and over the years, it had seen its fair share of tragedies, accidents, a mysterious disappearance, and even a fire that left part of the building in ruins. By the time I started my shift, the school had been closed for renovations, and my job was simple: patrol the halls, keep an eye on the construction site, and ensure no one trespassed. My first night was uneventful. I walked the empty corridors, my flashlight beam dancing across the faded lockers and peeling paint. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I chalked it up to nerves. As the weeks passed, though, things began to change. I started to notice unusual occurrences. It began with the sound of footsteps echoing in the halls when I was sure I was alone. Then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to follow me as I made my rounds. At first I told myself it was just the wind or the old building settling, but the more I heard, the more my unease grew. One night, while inspecting the basement, I stumbled upon a locked door I had never noticed before. It was heavy, rusted, and had a small window that offered a glimpse into darkness. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to find a way to open it. After a bit of searching, I found a crowbar in the maintenance room. I pried the door open, the hinges creaking like a long-forgotten secret. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, sending a shiver down my spine. I stepped inside, illuminating the room with my flashlight. The room was small and filled with old furniture, discarded desks and chairs piled haphazardly in the corner. But what caught my attention was a large, dusty mirror hanging on the wall. It had an ornate frame, and despite its age, the glass was surprisingly clear. As I approached, I felt an odd pull, as if the mirror was beckoning me closer. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing. When I turned back to the mirror, my breath caught in my throat. Reflected behind me was a figure, a girl in a tattered school uniform, her face obscured by shadows. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Who are you?" I shouted, but there was no answer. The girl's reflection smiled eerily and panic surged through me. I rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I needed to get out of that building. As I made my way through the halls, the whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around me like a tempest. "Help us! Help us!" they echoed, pulling at my sanity. I reached the staircase and hurried up to the second floor, hoping to find safety in the open air. When I reached the second floor, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt charged with energy, and I could see flickering lights ahead. As I approached, I realized it was coming from the old science lab. The door was ajar, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the lights flickered erratically, illuminating the room filled with dusty beakers and forgotten experiments. In the corner stood the same girl from the mirror, now fully visible, her eyes wide with fear. "You have to help us," she cried, her voice desperate. "Help you? What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "We're trapped," she pleaded. "They don't know we're here. We need you to find the others." Before I could respond, the lights flickered again and the room plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, the girl had vanished. The whispers swelled, echoing in my mind, urging me to follow. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, I began searching the room for any clues. I noticed a book lying open on one of the tables. It was a journal belonging to a student named Sarah, detailing her experiences at the school and her fears about the strange occurrences. One entry caught my eye. "We found the secret room. They took us. We can't escape." Suddenly the temperature dropped and I felt a rush of cold air. The whispers turned to screams, drowning out my thoughts. I stumbled back, realizing I was no longer alone. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, darting around the room, closing in on me. In a panic, I dashed back to the hallway, but the shadows followed, whispering my name. "You can't leave. You belong with us." I sprinted toward the exit, heart pounding in my chest. Just as I reached the front doors, I felt a cold hand grasp my shoulder. I turned, and there stood the girl, her face now twisted in anguish. "You can't escape. You're one of us now." With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free from her grip and flung the door open, sprinting into the night. I didn't stop running until I was safely in my car, heart racing, hands shaking. I drove away from Maplewood High, not daring to look back. I never returned to that school. The whispers and shadows still haunt my dreams, reminding me of the lost souls trapped within those walls. I learned a painful lesson that night. Some places hold on to their secrets, and some spirits are desperate for help that may never come. When I landed a job as a night security guard at the old Oak Ridge Asylum, I thought it would be a straightforward gig, just me, a few flickering lights, and the occasional raccoon rummaging through the trash. The asylum had been closed for over a decade, and its haunting history was well known in the town. Rumors of paranormal activity swirled around the dilapidated building. But I was skeptical. Ghosts weren't real. They were just stories meant to scare people. On my first night, I arrived just before sunset, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. The asylum loomed before me, its crumbling facade and broken windows giving it an ominous presence. I was assigned to patrol the main floors and ensure no one had broken in. Armed with a flashlight and my trusty walkie-talkie, I began my shift. The atmosphere inside was unsettling, the air stale and heavy. I walked through dimly lit corridors, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the cold concrete. As I moved from room to room, I couldn't help but feel a strange energy lingering in the air, like a whisper of the past refusing to let go. About halfway through my shift, I noticed something odd. The old patient records room, usually locked, stood ajar. Curiosity piqued. I approached cautiously. Inside, the walls were lined with dusty filing cabinets and scattered papers. I shone my flashlight around the room, illuminating the names of former patients, some with grim diagnoses and heartbreaking notes. As I rifled through the papers, I stumbled upon a file labeled Emily Carter. Her story was tragic. A young girl admitted at the age of 12, diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety. The notes detailed her struggles, her treatment, and ultimately her untimely death from a supposed suicide. I felt a pang of sadness wash over me. Suddenly, I heard a soft thud behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. The door to the records room had swung shut, and the room grew eerily silent. I knocked on the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose within me as I pounded on the wood. "Hello? Let me out," I shouted, but my voice echoed back, mocking my fear. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally creaked open. I stumbled out, gasping for breath. The hallway felt different now, darker, heavier. I could swear I heard faint whispers, like distant conversations floating through the air. Determined to shake off the unease, I resumed my patrol, but the whispers grew louder, surrounding me, filling my mind with fragments of sorrowful stories. "Help me! Help us!" they pleaded, and I felt a chill creep down my spine. I decided to check the common room, hoping to find some solace in the familiar surroundings. As I entered, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. A figure stood by the window, silhouetted against the moonlight. It looked like a young girl, her hair cascading down her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Is anyone there?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, but as I did, she vanished into thin air. My heart raced and I pinched myself, convinced I had to be dreaming. Then I heard a soft voice, barely a whisper, "Help me find my way home." I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The whispers crescendoed around me, a cacophony of sorrow and despair. I felt a sudden rush of cold air, and the lights flickered before plunging the room into darkness. In that moment, I realized I was not alone. The stories of the patients, their pain, their suffering, were alive, echoing through the asylum. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breath. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice tinged with desperation. "Help us." The girl's voice returned, more insistent now. The echoes of the past enveloped me, and I felt pulled toward the window where she had stood. I looked outside, and for a fleeting moment, I saw her reflection in the glass, a desperate child reaching out, seeking something lost. With a surge of determination, I grabbed my flashlight and began searching the room for a way to help. I rifled through old furniture and cabinets, and among the debris I found a small, tattered diary. It belonged to Emily. As I flipped through the pages, I discovered her thoughts, her fears, and her dreams. She longed to escape the confines of the asylum, to find freedom in the world outside. It was clear she had been trapped here, her spirit unable to move on. "Emily, I promise I'll help you," I whispered, feeling a connection to her pain. "Tell me what you need." The whispers shifted, becoming clearer. "The window?" I rushed back to the window, my heart pounding. I pulled it open, and a rush of cool night air flooded the room. "You can go now," I urged, my voice steady. "You're free." The air around me shifted, and I felt a warm breeze brush against my face. The whispers began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, the room felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. As I left the common room, the doors opened effortlessly, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The asylum no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place of healing. I walked through the halls, and for the first time I didn't hear the whispers. That night I finished my shift, feeling changed. I had helped a lost soul find peace, and in doing so, I found my own. Years later, I still think of Emily Carter and the echoes of the asylum. I left that night, but a part of me remains in those haunted halls, forever intertwined with the stories of those who came before. I work as a night security guard at the historic Bellamy Hotel. The hotel, with its grand architecture and ornate decor, attracts tourists during the day, but at night, it transforms into something else entirely. The shadows stretch and twist, and whispers seem to float through the air, as if the walls themselves are alive with stories waiting to be told. On a chilly autumn night, I started my shift with a sense of unease. The hotel was nearly empty, the guests having checked out earlier, leaving only a few stragglers scattered across the floors. I settled into my post at the front desk, the old clock ticking loudly in the silence. As I began my rounds, I made my way through the long hallways lined with portraits of past owners, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off as a trick of the mind. The hotel was beautiful, but it had its secrets, and I had heard the stories of room 217, a room that was said to be cursed. They said a woman had vanished from that room decades ago, her disappearance never explained. Guests reported strange noises, and many refused to stay in that room. I had always been curious about it, and that night as I passed the door I felt an inexplicable pull. Just a quick look, I told myself, my heart racing as I reached for the doorknob. I opened the door, and the room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. The bed was unmade, and the curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze from a cracked window. As I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, the air felt charged, and I could hear a faint whispering, a soft, sorrowful sound that seemed to echo from the walls. "Help me!" it called, barely audible. I froze, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I shouted, but there was no response. The room felt alive, and I could sense something was off. I took a step back, but my curiosity got the better of me. I needed to know what was happening. As I walked further into the room, my eyes were drawn to an old trunk sitting in the corner. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in years, covered in dust and cobwebs. I felt an overwhelming urge to open it. I knelt down, my fingers brushing against the latch, and with a deep breath I lifted the lid. Inside I found a collection of old letters, yellowed with age and tied together with a faded ribbon. I carefully untied them and began to read the first letter. It was from a woman named Margaret, written to her beloved, detailing her hopes and dreams. The letters were filled with love and longing. But as I read on, a sense of dread washed over me. The last letter was different. It spoke of desperation, of feeling trapped and alone. "They won't let me leave this place," it read. "I feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting." Just then the whispers grew louder, echoing in the room. "Help me. Find me." I looked around, my heart racing. "What do you want?" I cried out. But the only answer was the sound of my own voice bouncing off the walls. I felt a cold breeze wash over me, and I shivered as I realized I was not alone. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. Panic surged through me as I rushed toward it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into frantic cries, and I could feel the room closing in around me. "Help us," they pleaded, a chorus of sorrow that sent chills down my spine. "Who are you?" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. Suddenly the air shimmered, and I saw her, a figure standing in the corner, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with anguish. "I am Margaret," she said, her voice a mere whisper. "I was trapped here just like you. I need you to help me find peace." "Peace?" I echoed, my mind racing. "How can I help you?" "Find my diary," she implored, her form flickering like a candle flame. "It holds the truth of what happened to me. You must uncover it." With a surge of determination, I nodded. "Okay, I'll help you. Where do I find it?" "In the library," she said, her voice growing weaker. "But be careful. The darkness watches." Just as she finished speaking, the door swung open and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. I could still hear the whispers, urging me to hurry. I raced down the stairs to the library, my heart pounding in my chest. The library was vast, filled with towering shelves of books, and the atmosphere felt thick with secrets. I scanned the room, looking for anything that might lead me to Margaret's diary. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a small leather-bound book tucked away on a dusty shelf. I pulled it out and opened it, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with Margaret's handwriting, detailing her life in the hotel, her love story, and the dark events that had transpired. As I read, I learned that her fiancé had been murdered, and in the chaos she had been wrongfully accused, trapped in the hotel by forces that wanted to keep her silent. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Margaret's spirit had been trapped in the hotel, unable to move on because the truth had never been revealed. I knew what I had to do. I gathered the letters and the diary, determined to share her story. I made my way back to room 217, the air electric with anticipation. I cleared my throat, addressing the empty room. "Margaret, I have your diary. I will tell your story. You will not be forgotten." As I spoke, the atmosphere shifted and I felt the weight of the room lift. The whispers turned into a soft melody, filling the air with warmth. I sensed Margaret's presence beside me, her spirit glowing with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now filled with peace. "You have freed me." In that moment, I felt a rush of warmth envelop me, and as I opened my eyes, the room felt lighter. The shadows receded, and I knew that Margaret had finally found the closure she had been searching for. From that night on, the hotel felt different. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. I continued my shifts, but I never felt the weight of sorrow again. I shared Margaret's story with the world, ensuring that her memory lived on. And every so often, when I walked past room 217, I would feel a gentle breeze, as if she was still watching over the hotel, grateful to finally be free. I've worked the night shift as a security guard at the old Riverside Hospital. The hospital had been closed for years, a decaying structure that once bustled with life. Now it stood as a ghostly reminder of the past, its empty halls echoing with memories of both healing and despair. I had heard the stories from my fellow guards, tales of strange noises, flickering lights, and the feeling of being watched. Most dismissed them as urban legends, but I always felt a chill whenever I entered the building after dark. There was something about the place that felt alive, as if the walls themselves held onto the souls that had passed through. On a particularly stormy night, the rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled ominously overhead. I arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere thick with tension. The moment I stepped inside, I felt an unsettling energy in the air, a sense of foreboding that made my skin crawl. I settled into my usual routine. I patrolled the ground floor, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the vacant hallways. As I approached the old pediatric wing, I heard a faint sound, a child's laughter, light and carefree. My heart skipped a beat. It was strange to hear laughter in a place so steeped in sorrow. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty corridor. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered me. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. I continued my rounds, but the laughter lingered in my mind, unsettling me as I moved through the darkened halls. A few hours later, as I made my way back to the security office, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a child giggling, followed by the soft patter of footsteps. My heart raced as I turned toward the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello, is someone there?" I called, a mix of fear and curiosity gripping me. I approached the source of the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I rounded the corner, I spotted a small figure darting across the hallway. It was a little girl in pajamas, her hair tousled and wild. "Hey, wait," I shouted, but she vanished around the corner before I could reach her. I followed, my pulse quickening, but when I got to the next hallway, she was gone. "Where are you?" I called out, but the only response was the echo of my voice. I felt a chill creep up my spine. There was no reason for a child to be in a deserted hospital at this hour, I decided to check the pediatric wing again, my instincts telling me I needed to find her. As I entered the wing, the air felt heavy, thick with an unshakable unease. I moved cautiously, the laughter echoing faintly in the distance. It seemed to be coming from one of the patient rooms. I stood outside room 204, my heart pounding in my chest. The laughter was louder now, almost beckoning me. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the broken window. "Hello?" I called out, stepping inside. The room was empty, the bed neatly made, but the laughter continued echoing around me. I turned to leave, but just as I did, I caught sight of something in the corner of the room, a dusty old toy box. Compelled by some unseen force, I approached the box and lifted the lid. Inside, I found a collection of toys, stuffed animals, wooden blocks, and a small music box. As I lifted the music box, the laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that filled the air. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and I felt a rush of air sweep past me. I turned quickly, and there she was, the little girl standing at the foot of the bed, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "Help me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm lost." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "How are you here?" "I can't find my mommy," she replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't want to be here anymore." In that moment, I realized the truth. The girl was a spirit, trapped in the hospital, unable to move on. I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me, and I understood that I had to help her find peace. "Where did you last see your mommy?" I asked gently, kneeling down to her level. "In the nursery," she said, pointing toward the door, "but it's dark and scary." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I'll help you find her," I promised. "Let's go together." As we walked through the dark corridors, I could feel her presence beside me, a faint warmth in the cold air. The nursery was a few doors down, and as we approached, the atmosphere grew heavier, the darkness thickening. When we reached the nursery, I pushed the door open, revealing a room filled with cribs, now empty and covered in dust. The moonlight illuminated the room, casting ghostly shadows across the walls. "Mommy," the girl called out softly, her voice echoing in the stillness. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I scanned the room. "Is she here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's gone," the girl said, her face crumpling in sorrow. "She left me." In that moment, I realized that the girl had been waiting here for her mother, trapped in the hospital, unable to move on. I knelt beside her, feeling the weight of her sadness. "She loved you very much," I said gently, "but she's not here anymore. You need to let her go." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at me, her small body trembling. "I don't want to be alone," she whispered. "You're not alone," I reassured her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm here with you, and you can find peace. You can be free." As I spoke those words, I felt a change in the air. The darkness began to lift, and the room felt lighter. The girl looked at me, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "I can go now." With that, the atmosphere shifted, and I felt a warmth enveloping us both. The shadows receded, and the air brightened. The girl took a step back, her form shimmering as she began to fade. "Goodbye," she said, her voice now filled with a sense of calm. "I'll find my mommy." As she disappeared, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The hospital felt different now, lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened, the echo of her laughter lingering in the air. From that night on, I no longer felt the weight of despair in the hospital. The once ominous atmosphere transformed into a place of peace. I continued my shifts, but now I often found myself smiling at the memories of the little girl who had found her way back to the light. And every so often, when the wind howled outside, I would hear the faintest echo of laughter. a gentle reminder that love transcends even the darkest of places. My name is Daniel Price, and I've been the night security guard at the old Fairview Playhouse for 2 years. Once a vibrant theater, it had long since fallen into disrepair, with peeling paint and broken seats filling its once grand auditorium. The locals spoke of it with a mix of nostalgia and fear, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of performers who never left the stage after their final curtain call. I had always dismissed the ghost stories as mere tales spun to scare children, but as I settled into my nightly routine, I began to experience strange occurrences. The sound of distant laughter would echo through the hallways, and shadows seemed to flicker just beyond my field of vision. Still, I kept my head down and focused on my job, until one fateful night. It was a chilly October evening, and a storm brewed outside, rain lashing against the windows like frantic fingers. I was making my rounds, checking the various rooms, when I heard the unmistakable sound of applause coming from the main stage. My heart raced. The theater had been empty for years. Curiosity getting the better of me, I approached the stage, flashlight in hand. As I stepped into the darkened auditorium, the applause faded, replaced by a soft, melodious laughter. I scanned the room, but it was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing against the walls. No response came, only the sound of the rain pounding outside. I climbed onto the stage, drawn to the dusty spotlight that illuminated the center. As I stood there, the laughter returned, ringing out from the shadows backstage. It was a beautiful sound, yet it sent shivers down my spine. I took a deep breath and stepped into the wings. The backstage area was cluttered with old props and costumes, their colors faded with time. As I wandered deeper, I stumbled upon a forgotten dressing room. The door creaked open, revealing a mirror lined with lights that flickered like dying stars. The laughter echoed louder now, almost as if it was coming from the mirror itself. Suddenly I noticed something strange, a figure standing behind me in the reflection. I spun around, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and my heart dropped. The figure was still there, a young woman in a vintage costume, her face pale and shimmering. She smiled at me, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Don't be afraid," she said, her voice sweet and inviting. "We're just having a bit of fun." "What do you mean?" I stammered, taking a cautious step back. "Who are you?" "I'm Amelia," she said, her smile widening. "I was part of the last show here long ago. We never got to finish our performance." "Your performance?" I echoed, confusion swirling in my mind. "What happened?" "There was a fire," she explained, her gaze turning somber. "We were trapped backstage, and we never got to take our final bow. We've been waiting ever since." I felt a chill as the weight of her words sank in. "You mean, you're all still here?" Amelia nodded, her expression shifting from joy to longing. "We just want to perform again. Will you help us?" Before I could respond, the laughter erupted around me, filling the dressing room with energy. "Join us," they called, their voices intertwining in a haunting melody. I felt drawn to their plea, a deep-seated desire to honor their memory. "Okay," I said, my determination solidifying. "Let's finish your performance." In that moment, the atmosphere shifted and the dressing room transformed. The walls glowed with light, and the sound of an orchestra filled the air. I found myself standing on the stage, the audience invisible yet palpable, their anticipation electric. Amelia appeared beside me, her costume shimmering in the spotlight. "Just follow my lead," she said, her laughter infectious. The other performers materialized around us, their faces full of hope. As the music swelled, we began to dance, the movements flowing naturally as if I had been part of their troupe all along. I lost myself in the rhythm, the laughter echoing in my mind, and for the first time I felt a connection to something greater than myself. We danced and sang, the energy in the room building until it reached a crescendo. The audience erupted in applause, their cheers filling the air, and I could see the faces of the spirits lighting up with joy. They were finally receiving the recognition they had longed for. As the final note rang out, I took a bow alongside the performers, tears streaming down my face. I could feel their gratitude enveloping me, a warmth spreading through my heart. But just as quickly as the moment had begun, it faded. The lights flickered and dimmed, the music dissipating into silence. I stood alone on the stage, the echoes of laughter slowly fading away. "Thank you." A whisper floated through the air, and I turned to see Amelia one last time, her smile radiant. "We're finally free." With those words, she vanished, and the dressing room returned to its dusty, forgotten state. I stood in the silence, my heart still racing. I knew then that I had honored their memory, helping them finish their final performance. From that night on, I made it my mission to share their story. I spoke about the lost spirits of the Fairview Playhouse, ensuring that their laughter would echo in the hearts of those who would listen. And every time I walked through the theater, I could still hear the faint sound of applause, a reminder that some performances are never truly over. My name is Jenna Blackwood, and I've been a night security guard at the old WZRD radio station for 3 years. Located on the outskirts of town, the station had been off the air for over a decade, abandoned and left to decay. Rumors circulated about strange occurrences within its crumbling walls, whispers of ghostly broadcasts and eerie sounds filling the night air. Most dismissed it as urban legend, but I was drawn to the place, intrigued by its history. On my shifts, I would often explore the empty studios, imagining the vibrant voices that once filled the airwaves. The faded posters of long-forgotten musicians hung on the walls, and the dust-covered equipment sat idle, as if waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. But as the nights wore on, I began to notice something unsettling, a feeling of being watched and the faint sound of static crackling in the air. One stormy night in late October, I was making my regular rounds when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping like someone tapping a microphone. My heart raced as I followed the sound into the main broadcasting room. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the flickering lights from the control panel. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. "Is anyone there?" The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I stepped closer to the old microphone, its surface covered in dust. Suddenly the room filled with a low hum, and the lights flickered violently. "Help us!" A voice crackled through the static, sending chills down my spine. I stumbled back, my mind racing. "Who are you?" I shouted, but the voice faded into silence. Determined to uncover the source, I grabbed a flashlight and began to search the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I opened the old soundproof booth. Inside, I found an ancient reel-to-reel tape player, its spools covered in dust. I pressed the play button and the machine whirred to life. The tape crackled, and I was met with the sound of a voice, a man's voice, speaking urgently. "If you're hearing this, it means we've failed. The station is cursed. We're trapped in the airwaves and no one can hear us. You must—" The recording cut off abruptly, sending a jolt of fear through me. I glanced around the room, feeling a cold breeze sweep past me, extinguishing the flickering lights. The voice returned, now frantic and desperate. "You have to help us. We can't escape." Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. The voices haunting the station were the spirits of the radio hosts, trapped in a cycle of broadcasting their final message. I needed to do something, but what could I do to free them? "Let me help you," I shouted into the darkness. "What do you need?" There was a long pause, and then the voice returned, softer this time. "The broadcast, you must finish it." I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I approached the microphone. I knew I had to honor their last wishes, to give their story a voice. I turned on the station's equipment, the lights flickering back to life as I prepared to speak. This is WZRD Radio, broadcasting live from the abandoned station, I said, my voice steadying as I spoke into the microphone. If anyone is listening, know that we are not alone. There are spirits trapped within these walls yearning to be heard. They are the voices of those who once brought music and stories to life. The room grew still, and I could feel their presence surrounding me, urging me on. We remember you, I continued. Your stories matter. You are not forgotten. As I spoke, the static became a chorus of whispers, echoing my words. The air filled with energy, and I felt the spirits drawing closer, their voices merging with mine. Help us. Remember us, they chanted, and I could sense their relief. With each word, the atmosphere shifted, the heaviness lifting as I finished the broadcast. This is Jenna Blackwood signing off WZRD Radio, but never forgetting those who came before us. You will be remembered. The moment I finished, the lights flickered one last time and then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, but I felt a warmth enveloping me, a sense of peace settling over the space. I could hear the faint sound of music playing softly in the background, a melody I recognized from the past. Suddenly the air shimmered and I saw their faces, smiling, grateful, free. They had finally escaped the confines of the station, their spirits released from the burden of their final broadcast. As I stumbled out of the studio, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The storm outside had subsided, and a sense of calm enveloped the station. I knew I had honored their memory, and their voices would live on in the hearts of those who remembered. From that night on, I made it my mission to share their story with the world. The tale of WZRD Radio became a legend, a reminder that even in the darkest corners, the voices of the past can find a way to be heard, and every now and then when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear their laughter echoing in the air, a testament to the power of remembrance. It all started when I moved into a new town for my job. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and strange things don't stay hidden for long. I'd been there for a few weeks when I first noticed the old house on the edge of town, an imposing, decrepit structure shrouded in shadows. The locals avoided it, whispering about its history in hushed tones. Naturally, my curiosity got the better of me. One rainy evening, when the fog was so thick you could barely see 5 feet in front of you, I decided to check it out. The front gate creaked ominously as I pushed it open, and I couldn't help but shiver. The house was a Victorian monstrosity with tall, narrow windows and a roof that sagged as if the house was about to collapse from the weight of its own secrets. I walked up the cracked path, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, and pushed open the front door. It groaned on its hinges, revealing a dark, musty interior. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I shivered despite the warmth of my coat. I wandered through the rooms, each more decrepit than the last. There were faded portraits of stern-looking people whose eyes seemed to follow me. I kept hearing faint whispers, like people talking just beyond my hearing range. In the middle of the hallway, I found a door slightly ajar. The whispers were louder here, more urgent, like a crowd whispering in unison. With a mix of trepidation and excitement, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was cluttered with old furniture and cobwebs. A large mirror stood against the far wall, and its surface was covered in grime. I walked closer to it, compelled by an inexplicable urge to see my own reflection. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were saying something I couldn't quite make out. I wiped the mirror with the back of my hand, and my reflection emerged, pale and shaky in the dim light. Then I saw it. A figure appeared behind me in the mirror, its face obscured by shadow. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. My heart raced, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. I decided it was time to leave. As I walked back through the hallway, the whispers turned into a cacophony of panicked voices. I stumbled, trying to navigate the darkness, and almost ran into a rotting staircase. I decided to head back to the front door. The whispers were becoming increasingly frantic, pleading. Just as I reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I tried to open it, but it was stuck. The whispers had turned into screams. I pounded on the door, feeling a rising sense of dread. In a desperate attempt to escape, I turned and looked around the room. The once decrepit house seemed to be changing, warping around me. Shadows danced on the walls, forming shapes that seemed almost alive. Suddenly, the scream stopped. There was an eerie silence. My breathing was ragged as I looked around, trying to make sense of the sudden quiet. The mirror caught my eye again. I felt an icy chill run down my spine as I walked back to it, drawn by an unseen force. I looked into the mirror, and this time the figure was clearer. It was a woman, her face etched with terror. She pointed to her reflection, her mouth moving as if she was trying to tell me something. Then it all became clear. Her expression was a mirror of my own fear. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The whispers had been warnings. The house didn't just trap you, it made you part of its endless, whispering agony. I turned around, and the room was no longer just a room. It was a void of darkness with a swirling mist that seemed to pull me in. In that moment, I understood the truth. I was not alone. The house had claimed me, and now my voice would join the chorus of whispers, forever trapped in its malevolent grasp. I don't know if anyone will ever find me, or if this story will ever be told. But if you ever find yourself at the edge of town, staring at that old house with its whispering walls, remember this. Some places are better left unexplored, and some whispers are better left unheard. And always be cautious about what you might find in the dark corners of the world, or your own mind. And if you think you hear whispers coming from nowhere, just remember, they might be calling for you. It was a stormy October night when I moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town. I'd always been drawn to the macabre, so when I saw this place on the market, I knew I had to have it. The agent had warned me about its history, something about strange occurrences and a family that had vanished without a trace, but I wasn't about to let that deter me. After all, I had a penchant for the eerie and unexplained. The first few nights were uneventful, though the house was far from welcoming. Its age was evident in the creaky floorboards and the musty smell that clung to the air. I spent the evenings unpacking and trying to make the place feel like home. It wasn't until the fourth night that things took a turn for the unsettling. I had just settled into bed when I heard a faint whispering. It was barely audible, like the rustling of dry leaves, but it was unmistakably there. I convinced myself it was just the wind or the old pipes settling. Still, I found myself lying awake, listening to the steady rhythm of the storm outside. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. A voice, soft, pleading. I tried to ignore it, turning my pillow over and pulling the covers up to my chin. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the basement. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. The basement door groaned as I opened it, and the smell of damp earth and mildew hit me like a wall. I flicked on the flashlight and descended the stairs, the beam of light cutting through the oppressive darkness. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of forgotten relics, and a thick layer of dust. I shone the flashlight around, looking for the source of the sound. My heart raced as the whispering intensified, now forming words I could barely understand. Help us. Find us. I turned my attention to an old trunk in the corner, its surface covered in cobwebs. The whispers seemed to be coming from it. My hands trembled as I pried it open. Inside were a collection of old letters and photographs, all yellowed with age. The photographs depicted a family, a man, a woman, and a young girl. Their eyes seemed to follow me, filled with a sorrow that chilled me to the bone. Among the letters was one addressed to the forgotten ones, dated more than a century ago. The letter spoke of a family trapped in a perpetual cycle of torment, their souls bound to the house. They had been searching for someone to release them from their suffering, and it seemed they had finally found me. A cold draft swept through the basement, and I could hear the whispering grow louder, more desperate. I felt a presence behind me, a chilling breath on my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive darkness and the feeling of being watched. I raced back upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I had to get out of the house, but the storm had intensified, and the roads were now flooded. I was trapped. That night I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of the trapped souls. As dawn broke, I decided to investigate further. I went back to the basement with the intention of finding more clues. The trunk was still there, but now it was empty. The letters and photographs were gone, as if they had never been there at all. Confused and unsettled, I decided to research the house's history. The town archives revealed something chilling. The family that had lived there had indeed vanished, but not in the way the legend had suggested. They had been involved in a horrific accident, their bodies never found. The house had been abandoned for years, and the stories of hauntings were merely the town's way of explaining the inexplicable, the echoes of their despair lingering in the walls. As I pieced together the truth, I realized that the family had never left the house in a spiritual sense. They had been trapped by their own tragic end, their souls bound to the place. The true horror was not in the supernatural, but in the sheer finality of their fate. I left the house the next day, never to return. It now stands empty once more, a grim reminder of the past. And though I don't believe in ghosts in the traditional sense, I sometimes hear the faintest whisper when the wind howls through the trees, a reminder of the echoes that linger in forgotten places. And that's the real twist of the story. Sometimes the true horror isn't the supernatural, but the unresolved, tragic echoes of the past that refuse to let go. My name is Lila Foster, and I've always been intrigued by the supernatural. Growing up in the small town of Blackwood, I heard countless stories about the old Blackwood Manor, a sprawling estate perched on the edge of town. It was said to be haunted by the ghost of Lady Eleanor, a tragic figure who had mysteriously vanished over a century ago. When I learned that the manor was being opened for tours, I couldn't resist the opportunity to explore its secrets. The day of the tour arrived, and I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation as I approached the manor. Its grand facade was both beautiful and foreboding, the ivy creeping up its walls like fingers reaching for the sky. The air was thick with anticipation, and as I stepped inside, I was struck by the eerie silence that enveloped the rooms. The tour guide, an elderly man named Mr. Thorne, shared the history of the manor as we wandered through its dimly lit halls. He spoke of Lady Eleanor's beauty and grace, her tragic fate, and the rumors that surrounded her disappearance. According to legend, she had fallen in love with a commoner, and her family had forbidden the relationship, leading to her untimely demise. As the tour continued, I found myself drawn to a particular room, the library. It was filled with dusty books and faded portraits, but what caught my attention was a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. As I approached it, I felt a strange pull, as if something within the glass was trying to reach out to me. I leaned closer, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure behind me in the reflection, a woman in a flowing white dress. My heart raced as I turned, but the room was empty. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the light, yet the feeling of being watched lingered. Later that evening, after the tour concluded, I couldn't shake the urge to return to the library. Something about the mirror beckoned me. As I stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the whispers began. soft, melancholic murmurs that seemed to echo from the depths of the glass. "Help me," a voice pleaded, sending chills down my spine. "Who are you?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. "I am Eleanor," the voice replied, filled with sorrow. "I am trapped in this mirror, lost between worlds. You must help me find peace." Panic surged within me, but I was captivated by her voice. "How can I help you?" I asked, feeling a strange sense of connection. "Uncover the truth of my disappearance. Only then can I be free," she urged. Determined to aid her, I began researching Lady Eleanor's story the following day. I delved into old records, newspaper clippings, and town archives, piecing together the fragments of her life. I learned that she had indeed fallen in love with a commoner named Thomas, but their love was thwarted by her family's strict expectations. As I uncovered more, I discovered that on the night of her disappearance, Eleanor had planned to elope with Thomas. But on that fateful night, she was never seen again. The rumors swirled, suggesting that her family had kept her confined in the manor, but I needed more proof. I returned to Blackwood Manor armed with my findings. As I stepped into the library, the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest. I approached the mirror once more, my heart racing. "Eleanor, I know what happened," I said, my voice steady. "You were trying to escape with Thomas." "Yes," she whispered, her voice laced with desperation. "But they found me. I was too late." "What do you want me to do?" I asked, feeling the weight of her sorrow. "Find my locket," she urged, her voice trembling. "It holds the key to my story. It's hidden in the attic." With renewed determination, I climbed the creaking stairs to the attic, my heart pounding in anticipation. The attic was filled with cobwebs and forgotten memories, but I searched fervently, rummaging through old trunks and dusty furniture. Finally, I spotted a small wooden box pushed into the corner. Inside, nestled among old letters and trinkets, lay a delicate locket. I held it in my hands, its surface cool to the touch. As I opened it, I found a portrait of Eleanor and Thomas, their faces radiant with love. Beneath the portrait was a note, written in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. "My dearest Thomas, if you find this, know that my love for you is eternal. I will always be waiting for you, even if the world tries to keep us apart." Tears filled my eyes as I read her words, realizing the depth of their love and the tragedy that had befallen her. I hurried back to the library, clutching the locket tightly. "Eleanor, I found it," I called out. As I stood before the mirror, I felt a surge of energy. The whispers grew louder, and I could see Eleanor's reflection more clearly now, her face filled with hope. "Thank you, Lila," she said, her voice softening. "You've given me my story back." In that moment, the mirror shimmered, and I felt a warmth envelop me, a sense of release. The shadows that had clung to her began to dissipate, and I could see the library transform around us. The dusty shelves filled with life, and I saw Eleanor standing before me, no longer a ghost, but a radiant figure bathed in light. "I am free," she exclaimed, her joy palpable. "Thank you for remembering me." As she stepped away from the mirror, a bright light enveloped her, and I felt a rush of warmth. The whispers faded into silence, and the air grew still. I watched as Eleanor's spirit ascended, her smile radiant, leaving behind a shimmering glow in the room. The mirror returned to its stillness, but I knew it no longer held a sorrowful spirit. I had freed Eleanor, allowing her story to be told and her love to endure. In the days that followed, I shared Eleanor's tale with the townspeople, revealing the truth behind her disappearance. Her story became a part of Blackwood's history, a testament to love that transcends time and space. As I stood outside the manor, the sun setting behind it, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had not only uncovered a haunting mystery, but had also forged a connection with a spirit who had been lost for far too long. And every now and then, when the wind rustled through the trees, I could almost hear Eleanor's whispers, a gentle reminder that love is never truly lost. My name is Ben Walker, and I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up in a small town surrounded by dense forests, I spent countless weekends hiking and camping, reveling in the beauty of nature. But it was during one particular trip that I stumbled upon something that would haunt me forever. It was a crisp autumn day when I decided to venture deeper into the woods than I ever had before. The trail was overgrown, the trees towering overhead like ancient sentinels. As I walked, I felt a strange sense of unease, as if something were watching me from the shadows. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. After hours of hiking, I found a clearing with a small serene lake at its center. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the vibrant colors of the trees surrounding it. I set up my camp there, eager to enjoy the tranquility. As the sun began to set, I built a fire and settled in to cook a simple meal. But as darkness enveloped the forest, an unsettling feeling crept in. The silence was palpable, broken only by the crackling of the fire. That's when I first noticed it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My heart raced as I squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. The figure didn't move, almost as if it were waiting for something. I stood up, feeling an urge to approach, but something in my gut told me to stay put. The figure remained still, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the fear and return to my campfire, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the trees. I forced myself to eat, my heart pounding as I occasionally glanced back toward the woods. Hours passed, and the figure never left my sight. I finally decided to turn in for the night, crawling into my tent and trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But sleep wouldn't come. The whispers of the wind outside mingled with my racing thoughts, and I lay there, wide awake, listening for any sign of movement. In the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a soft rustling outside my tent. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The sound grew louder, and I could hear footsteps approaching. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I unzipped the tent flap. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. The rustling stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a voice emerged from the darkness, low and gravelly. "Leave this place." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you want?" I managed to stammer, but the voice didn't respond. Instead, I saw a shadow move just beyond the trees, and I turned on my flashlight, shining it toward the source of the voice. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, with eyes that glimmered like cold steel. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back into my tent, heart racing. "Leave this place," the voice repeated, more urgent this time. I scrambled to gather my belongings, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I fumbled with my gear, my hands shaking as I packed up the tent. Outside, the figure remained still and silent, watching me with an intensity that felt suffocating. As I zipped up my bag, I caught a glimpse of the figure moving closer, its form shifting like smoke. Panic surged through me, and in a burst of instinct I bolted from the tent, flashlight in hand, and sprinted toward the path I had come from. The woods were alive with shadows, and the trees loomed over me like twisted fingers. I could hear footsteps behind me, echoing in the darkness, and I didn't dare look back. The voice echoed in my mind, urging me to leave, and I ran faster, branches scratching at my arms as I pushed deeper into the forest. Just when I thought I might escape, I tripped over a root and fell to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hands, and the beam flickered out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and listened closely. The footsteps had stopped. "Please, just leave," the voice whispered again. But this time it was softer, almost pleading. I stood there, frozen in fear, trying to catch my breath. The shadows danced around me, and I felt the weight of the figure's presence closing in. What do you want from me? I shouted into the darkness, desperation creeping into my voice. There was a pause, and then the figure stepped into the faint light of the moon. It was the same tall silhouette, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a woman. Her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "Help me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm trapped here. I can't escape." My heart ached as I looked at her, the fear slowly fading. "How can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The forest holds me captive. You must find the heart of the woods and release the spirits that bind me here." Just then the wind picked up, swirling around us, and I felt a surge of energy building in the air. "Please, you must hurry," she urged, her voice rising in urgency, "or I will be lost forever." With newfound determination, I nodded and turned, sprinting deeper into the woods, guided by the faint whispers of the spirits. I could feel the energy pulling me forward, leading me to a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a massive ancient oak, its trunk twisted and gnarled. As I approached, I could hear the echoes of countless voices, their cries blending into a haunting melody. "Release us, release us," they sang, and I felt the air thrum with power. I reached the base of the tree and pressed my hands against the rough bark, closing my eyes. "I release you," I shouted, pouring every ounce of strength into my words. In an instant, the ground trembled and the whispers transformed into a crescendo of voices, rising high into the night. The air crackled with energy, and I felt the weight of the spirits lifting. The woman appeared beside me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her form beginning to fade as the spirits were freed. As the last echoes of their cries faded into silence, I opened my eyes to find myself alone in the clearing. The weight of the darkness was gone, replaced by a serene stillness. The moon shone brightly overhead, illuminating the path back to my campsite. I made my way back, the fear still lingering but now mixed with a sense of triumph. As I packed my things and left the woods behind, I felt a connection to the woman and the spirits I had freed. From that day forward, I carried their story with me, a reminder of the power of compassion and courage. I may have gone into the woods seeking adventure, but I emerged with a deeper understanding of the shadows that dwell within us all, and the light that can set us free. My name is Clara, and I've always had a love for music. As a child, I would spend hours playing the piano, losing myself in melodies that transported me to other worlds. But my passion took a strange turn when I inherited my grandmother's old estate after she passed away. Among her belongings was a dusty grand piano, its keys yellowed with age and its wood dulled by neglect. Little did I know, this piano held secrets that would change my life forever. The day I moved into the estate, I was drawn to the piano. It sat in the corner of the dimly lit parlor, surrounded by faded photographs and cobwebs. I couldn't resist the urge to play. As my fingers danced over the keys, I played a few simple notes, but something felt off. The sound echoed in the room, a haunting melody that seemed to resonate with an unseen presence. That night, I had a vivid dream. I found myself in a grand ballroom, dressed in a flowing gown, surrounded by elegantly dressed couples dancing under the shimmering chandeliers. The music was enchanting, and I felt a sense of belonging. But as I looked closer, I noticed the faces of the dancers were blurred, as if they were shrouded in mist. When I woke, I felt an inexplicable longing to return to the piano. I played the same notes I had in my dream, and to my astonishment, a soft voice whispered from the shadows, "Play the melody. Free us." Startled, I stopped playing and looked around, but there was no one there. Shaking off the chill that ran down my spine, I continued practicing, but the whispers persisted, growing louder with each passing day. Play the melody. Remember us. Determined to understand, I began researching the history of the estate. I discovered that my grandmother had once hosted lavish balls in the very ballroom from my dream, where music filled the air and laughter echoed off the walls. But tragedy struck when a fire consumed the estate during one fateful gathering, taking the lives of many guests, including a renowned composer who had played the piano that night. The more I learned, the more I felt the pull of the music. The whispers were not just echoes of the past. They were the spirits of those who had perished, bound to the piano and desperate for their stories to be heard. One evening I decided to delve deeper into the mystery. I set up my recording equipment, determined to capture the whispers. As I played, the notes filled the air, intertwining with the whispers, creating a haunting harmony. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to dance around me. "Clara, you must remember the melody," the voice urged, clearer now. "It holds the key to our freedom." With every note I played, visions of the ballroom flooded my mind. Elegant couples twirling gracefully, their faces filled with joy. But then, the fire erupted, flames licking at the walls, panic spreading through the crowd. I could hear their screams, their cries for help, and I felt the weight of their despair. "Remember, they cried in unison, their voices echoing in the depths of my mind. "Remember the melody." Desperate to help them, I returned to the piano and played with all my heart. I closed my eyes, allowing the music to flow through me. Suddenly the room transformed. I was back in the ballroom, surrounded by the dancers, the air thick with the scent of roses and candle wax. The music swelled, and I felt their presence all around me. The blurred faces became clearer, and I recognized the sorrow in their eyes. "Play the final notes, Clara," the composer urged, his voice resonating with urgency. "Only then can we be free." I took a deep breath, my fingers flying over the keys as I played the melody I had heard in my dreams. With each note, I felt the energy in the room shift, a palpable tension building. The dancers moved in unison, their spirits intertwining with the music, and I knew I was close to unlocking their freedom. With one final chord, the music reached a crescendo, and the room erupted in light. The spirits of the dancers swirled around me, their faces glowing with gratitude. I felt their joy and relief wash over me, and in that moment I understood the power of the melody. "Thank you, Clara," the composer said, his voice now a gentle whisper. "You have freed us from our torment. We can finally rest." As the light enveloped them, I felt a warmth spread through my heart. The weight of their sorrow lifted, and the whispers faded into a soft, harmonious hum. The ballroom dissolved, and I found myself back in the parlor, the piano still echoing with the final notes of the melody. The air was different now, lighter, filled with a sense of peace. I had not only uncovered the secrets of the past, but had also given the spirits the freedom they longed for. I knew that the music would forever hold a special place in my heart, a reminder of the lives intertwined with my own. In the days that followed, I continued to play the piano, but now it was filled with joy rather than sorrow. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sweet melodies that resonated through the estate. I decided to honor the memory of those lost by hosting a concert in the ballroom, inviting the townspeople to celebrate the music that had once brought them together. As I played for the crowd, I felt their spirits watching over me, their laughter echoing in the walls. I realized that the true power of music lies not just in its ability to entertain, but in its capacity to connect us to the past, to heal wounds, and to free the forgotten melodies that linger in the air. I'm Ethan Reed, a real estate agent by trade. known for flipping old properties in search of hidden gems. Last month, I stumbled upon a dilapidated mansion on the outskirts of Blackwood, a place shrouded in local lore and whispers. The locals warned me about its past, rumors of strange occurrences and people disappearing, but the thrill of uncovering its secrets drew me in like a moth to a flame. The mansion, once grand, now stood as a decaying relic of its former self, vines creeping up its cracked walls. I wasn't deterred. Armed with my camera and a flashlight, I stepped inside, the door creaking ominously behind me. Dust motes swirled in the air and the musty smell of neglect filled my nostrils. As I roamed through the rooms, I felt an unsettling energy, as if the house itself was alive, watching me. The walls whispered stories of the past, and shadows danced on the edges of my vision. I documented everything, capturing the peeling wallpaper, the shattered glass, and the remnants of forgotten lives. In the corner of the main hall, I noticed a door, partially hidden behind a rotting bookshelf. It was smaller than the others, almost child-sized. Curiosity piqued. I pushed the shelf aside and opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. Just a little further, I whispered to myself, excitement tinged with trepidation. I switched on my flashlight and descended, the air growing cooler and heavier with each step. At the bottom, I found myself in a dimly lit room, its walls lined with old photographs. They were sepia-toned, depicting families and children, their faces frozen in time. But something felt off. Their eyes seemed to follow me, a mix of sadness and longing. In the center of the room stood a dusty pedestal, and on it rested a small, intricately carved music box. The box was beautiful, adorned with delicate flowers, and I felt an inexplicable urge to open it. As I lifted the lid, a haunting melody filled the room. The moment the music played, the atmosphere shifted, the shadows deepened, and a chill enveloped me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers returned, softer this time, like a distant lullaby. "Help us! Help us!" Suddenly, the photographs began to shift, the faces transforming into distorted expressions of anguish. "They're trapped," I realized, a wave of dread washing over me. "They need to be freed." Panic surged through me as the music box continued to play. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. "You must remember. You must remember." I stumbled back, crashing into a stack of boxes. A dusty mirror fell to the ground, shattering into 1,000 pieces. As the shards scattered, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection. My face twisted in fear, but behind me stood a figure, a child with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression. "Help us," the child whispered, reaching out with a skeletal hand. Without thinking, I turned and bolted up the stairs, my heart racing. I flung the door open and sprinted down the hall, desperate to escape. But as I reached the front door, it slammed shut, trapping me inside. The whispers morphed into anguished cries echoing in my mind. "You can't leave, Ethan. You're one of us now." In a frenzy, I turned back, realizing I had to confront the truth. I grabbed the music box, clinging to it as if it held the key to my escape. I raced back to the secret room, heart pounding in my ears. The photographs loomed over me, their eyes pleading. "Play the music," the child's voice echoed. "Set us free." I placed the music box on the pedestal and opened it again. The haunting melody filled the room once more, and the shadows began to swirl violently. The faces in the photographs screamed silently as they were pulled into the melody, their forms twisting and contorting. "Remember," the child urged, and suddenly flashes of memories flooded my mind. I saw myself as a boy, laughing and playing with friends. But then a dark event unfolded, a tragic accident that took my life too soon. I was one of them. I was one of the lost souls trapped in this house for decades, unable to move on. With newfound determination, I closed my eyes and focused on the music, channeling all my energy into breaking the curse. "You're free!" I shouted, willing the spirits to be released. The music swelled, and the room erupted in a blinding light. I felt a rush of wind as the shadows dissipated, and the cries faded into a serene silence. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty, the photographs now blank, the music box still. I was alone, but something had shifted. I stumbled back, disoriented, and found the front door now ajar. I stepped outside, gasping for fresh air, the weight of the mansion's history lifting from my shoulders. As I turned to look back, the house seemed to shimmer, its dark energy dissipating into the twilight. But just as I took a step away, I heard a soft voice behind me, whispering from the depths of the mansion, "Thank you, Ethan." And then, just like that, the door creaked shut, sealing the forgotten room once more. I've always had a fascination with antiques. I'm a vintage furniture restorer, living in a small town called Hollow Creek, where the air is thick with the nostalgia of a bygone era. I stumbled upon an old mirror at a dusty estate sale, hidden beneath a pile of forgotten trinkets. Its ornate frame was beautiful, but the glass was tarnished, giving it a ghostly sheen. I couldn't resist purchasing it, convinced it would be a stunning addition to my workshop. As soon as I brought the mirror home, I felt an unusual energy radiating from it. I set it against the wall of my workshop, surrounded by sawdust and the scent of varnish. It stood there, silently watching me as I worked late into the night. Each time I glanced at it, I felt a pull, as if the mirror was calling to me. One evening, while applying a fresh coat of paint to an old chair, I caught my reflection in the mirror. But it wasn't just my reflection staring back. There was something lurking behind me. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the workshop was empty. I shook it off, attributing it to exhaustion. The next night, as I worked late again, the whispers began. Faint at first, they grew louder, wrapping around me like tendrils of fog. "Evan, help us." I froze, paintbrush hovering above the chair. My heart pounded as I approached the mirror, drawn by the sound. I stared into its depths, and for a moment the glass rippled like water. I saw shadows darting behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing, just the dark corners of my workshop. "Evan, help us." This time the voice was clearer, more urgent. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I stepped closer and placed my hand on the cold surface. "Who are you?" I whispered. A low, mournful wail echoed, and suddenly the mirror darkened. Images flickered across the glass, faces twisted in despair, trapped in an endless cycle of sorrow. I stumbled back, breathless, as the whispers grew into a cacophony. "You must free us." Panic surged through me, but curiosity held me captive. "How?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Find the key. Unlock the truth." The mirror pulsed with energy, and in that moment, I knew I had to uncover the story behind it. Over the next few days, I delved into the history of the mirror, piecing together its dark past. It once belonged to a family who had mysteriously vanished, leaving behind nothing but whispers and shadows. Locals spoke of a curse, claiming that the mirror trapped the souls of those who gazed into it too long. Despite the warnings, I felt an undeniable connection to the mirror. I returned to the workshop, determined to set things right. I stood before it, heart racing, and began to chant the words I had discovered in my research. "I seek the truth. I seek to free you." The glass shimmered ominously, and the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. I felt a violent pull, as if the mirror were trying to consume me. "No, you must not look away," the voices screamed. With a surge of determination, I pressed my palm against the surface. "I will help you," I shouted. And in that moment, the mirror exploded into 1,000 shards, and I was enveloped in darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in an unfamiliar room, dimly lit and filled with dust. The air was heavy with the scent of decay. I looked around, disoriented, and realized I was inside the mirror. trapped in the very world I had seen through its glass. In front of me stood the tormented souls I had glimpsed before, their faces etched with anguish. "You've come to join us," one of them said, her voice hollow. "Now you'll never escape." Panic set in as I backed away, but the walls of the room began to close in on me. The whispers returned, but this time they were filled with sorrow rather than urgency. "Evan, you should have listened." Desperation clawed at my throat. I had become what I feared most, a prisoner of the mirror's curse. I stumbled, falling to my knees, realizing there was no escape. As I looked into the shards scattered around me, I saw my own reflection among the lost souls, and I understood the truth. I had freed them, but at a terrible cost. The mirror had claimed me, and now I would be just another whisper in the darkness, waiting for the next curious soul to gaze into its depths. And so the cycle continued as the mirror awaited its next victim, hidden in the shadows of Hollow Creek. My name is Rachel Thompson, and I've always had a fascination with art. After years of saving, I finally purchased an old Victorian-style house in the sleepy town of Millfield, known for its rich history and quirky charm. The house was perfect for me, a hidden gem filled with character, and it even had an attic rumored to hold forgotten treasures. Little did I know, it also housed a dark secret. It was a chilly evening in March 2024 when I decided to explore the attic. I had spent weeks unpacking and restoring the house, but the attic remained untouched, filled with dust-covered boxes and cobwebs. Armed with a flashlight, I ascended the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking ominously beneath my weight. As I pushed open the heavy door, a musty smell engulfed me. The faint beam of my flashlight revealed a room cluttered with old furniture, forgotten memories, and, in the far corner, a large, ornate portrait covered by a tattered sheet. Intrigued, I made my way toward it, feeling an inexplicable pull. With a gentle tug, I removed the sheet, and my breath caught in my throat. The painting depicted a woman in a strikingly elegant gown, her expression both serene and haunting. Her eyes seemed to follow me, filled with an emotion that was difficult to decipher. Beneath the portrait was a small plaque that read, "Isabella Hawthorne, 1892. I couldn't shake the feeling that the painting was alive, as if Isabella was trying to communicate with me. I decided to hang it in my living room, convinced that it would add character to my new home. That evening, as I settled in with a cup of tea, I found myself glancing at the portrait more than once. There was something about it that drew me in, and I couldn't help but feel a connection to Isabella. As the days passed, I began to notice strange occurrences. The temperature in the living room would drop unexpectedly, and I often heard faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the portrait. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination running wild, but the sensations grew more intense. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I swore I heard a soft voice calling my name. "Rachel." Startled, I sat up, heart pounding. I glanced at the portrait, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw Isabella's lips move. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved into the history of the Hawthorne family. I discovered that Isabella had lived a tragic life. She was said to have been an artist herself, and her untimely death remained a mystery. Rumors of betrayal and heartache surrounded her story, and I felt a deep empathy for her plight. One stormy night, as rain poured against the windows, I found myself drawn back to the attic. I needed answers. As I ascended the staircase, the air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch ominously. Upon reaching the attic, I felt an overwhelming sense of presence, as if Isabella was urging me to uncover her story. I began to rummage through the old boxes, searching for anything that might shed light on her life. In one dusty trunk, I found a collection of letters, yellowed with age. As I read through them, I realized they were love letters addressed to Isabella from a man named Jonathan, filled with passion and longing. But the final letter was different, a desperate plea, filled with anguish and heartbreak, revealing that he had been forced to leave her for reasons unknown. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the attic, extinguishing my candle and plunging the room into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam flickering wildly. In that moment, I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, sending chills down my spine. I turned, and there stood Isabella, her ghostly figure illuminated in the dim light. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. "I need you to finish what was started." Before I could respond, she vanished, leaving only a lingering chill. I felt compelled to follow her spirit, and I hurried back to the living room where the portrait hung. As I stood before it, I noticed something peculiar. The eyes of the painting seemed to shimmer, and the atmosphere around me thickened. Determined to help her, I began to paint, pouring my heart into a canvas beside the portrait. I painted the love that had once filled her life, capturing her essence with every brushstroke. Hours passed, and with each stroke I felt Isabella's presence grow stronger, her spirit guiding my hand. Finally, I stepped back to admire my work. The canvas depicted Isabella and Jonathan together, a moment frozen in time, their love radiating from the painting. As I placed the canvas beside the portrait, the room grew silent, the air heavy with anticipation. In an instant, the lights flickered and a surge of energy filled the room. Isabella's spirit appeared, her expression transformed from sorrow to joy. "Thank you," she breathed, tears glistening in her eyes. "You have freed me from my pain." As she reached out, a blinding light enveloped us, and I felt her warmth wash over me. The portrait shimmered and began to dissolve, the colors swirling into a vibrant whirlwind. I stood there, heart racing, as the room filled with laughter and love. But just as quickly as it began, it ended. The light faded, and I found myself alone in the living room, the portrait now just a blank canvas. Confused, I glanced around, but the air felt different, lighter, almost liberated. I realized that I had not only freed Isabella, but had also released the energy that had lingered in the house for far too long. As I stepped back, I felt a sense of completion wash over me. The house, once filled with sorrow, now felt alive, resonating with the joy of a love story finally told. I smiled, knowing that Isabella's spirit could now rest in peace, and I had played a part in her journey. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement. I hesitated, my heart pounding. The attic door creaked open, and a new shadow emerged from the darkness. It was another portrait, another story waiting to be uncovered, and deep down I knew that my journey was far from over. My name is Mia Thompson, and I've been a caretaker at the Old Hollow Asylum for 3 long years. Nestled in the woods on the outskirts of a small town, the asylum had a notorious reputation. Once a haven for the mentally ill, it had been abandoned for decades, its crumbling walls echoing with the whispers of those who had suffered within. I took the job out of desperation, needing a steady income, but soon learned that the asylum held secrets darker than I could have imagined. It was a stormy evening in late April 2024 when I found myself alone in the asylum, preparing for my nightly rounds. Thunder rumbled ominously outside, and rain lashed against the cracked windows. The air inside was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off as nerves. As I wandered through the dimly lit hallways, I noticed the remnants of the past. A broken wheelchair, faded photographs hanging askew, and rusted bed frames that lined the walls like forgotten tombstones. The asylum had been stripped of its former glory, but it still had a haunting beauty that drew me in. It was during my 3rd round that I first heard the whispers. They were soft, almost melodic, drifting through the air like a haunting lullaby. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I followed the sound, it grew louder, more insistent. I turned the corner and found myself in front of room 217, a door I had never opened. The whispers seemed to be coming from within. With a mixture of fear and curiosity, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. The air was colder here, and I felt a sense of foreboding wash over me. In the corner, a tattered journal lay open on a small table, its pages yellowed with age. I picked it up, and as I flipped through the pages, I realized it belonged to a patient named Eliza Wells. Her entries were filled with anguish, detailing her struggles with the darkness inside her mind. As I read, I felt a strange connection to her words, as if they resonated with my own hidden fears. But it was the final entry that sent chills down my spine. They come for me in the night. I can feel them lurking in the shadows. I fear I will forget who I am. If anyone finds this, know that I am not alone. Suddenly the whispers intensified, swirling around me like a tempest. I dropped the journal, heart racing, and stumbled backward. In that moment, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the room. It was a woman, her features indistinct, but her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am lost, trapped in this place." I was paralyzed with fear, but something about her drew me in. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "I am Eliza," she said, her voice echoing in my head. "I need you to remember me, to help me break free. This place is a prison for my memories." I felt an overwhelming urge to help her, but doubt gnawed at me. "How can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Find the others," she urged, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. "They are here, trapped like me. You must bring their stories to light." With that, Eliza's figure faded into the shadows, leaving me alone in the dark room. The air felt heavy, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. I knew I had to act quickly, or I might become just another lost soul in the asylum. Over the next few nights, I scoured the asylum, searching for the remnants of Eliza's fellow patients. I discovered more journals, each revealing heartbreaking tales of despair, loss, and the longing for freedom. I felt their pain and their desperation, and with each entry I read, the shadows in the asylum grew more restless. One night, as I was reading through another journal, I noticed the temperature drop sharply. The whispers morphed into frantic cries, and I could feel the shadows closing in around me. "Mia, help us," they wailed, their voices merging into a cacophony of sorrow. Determined, I gathered all the journals and returned to room 217. I lit candles and placed them around the room, hoping to create a space of warmth amid the darkness. As I began to read the entries aloud, I felt a surge of energy in the air. The shadows danced around me, swirling with anticipation. With each word I spoke, the atmosphere shifted, and I could see the figures of the lost patients forming in the corners of the room. They were ethereal, glowing softly like lanterns in the dark. Eliza stood before me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've done it," she whispered. "You've brought us together again." The shadows grew brighter, and I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. The spirits of the lost patients began to swirl around the room, their faces illuminated with hope. "Thank you, Mia," they chorused, their voices harmonizing into a beautiful melody. But just as I felt the weight of their gratitude, a dark presence surged through the room, pushing against the light. "No, you cannot take them," I shouted, realizing that the asylum was fighting back, unwilling to let go of its lost souls. In that moment, I understood the truth. The asylum thrived on their despair. It fed on the darkness of their memories. "We will not be forgotten," I cried, my voice rising above the chaos. With newfound strength, I lifted the journals high and shouted, "You are more than your pain. You will not be trapped here." The shadows shrieked, a deafening sound that rattled the walls, but I held my ground. Light burst forth from the journals, enveloping the room and pushing back the darkness. The spirits of the patients shone brightly, their forms becoming radiant. One by one they reached out, their hands connecting with mine, and as they did, I felt their memories flooding into me. In that moment, I became the keeper of their stories, the vessel that would carry their pain and their joy into the world. The asylum trembled around us, but I stood firm, surrounded by the light of their memories. Finally, with one last surge of energy, the darkness began to dissipate, and the patient's spirits ascended into the night sky, free at last. Eliza turned to me, her face radiant with gratitude. "You've saved us, Mia. Remember us." With that, they vanished, leaving me alone in the room, the air now filled with an overwhelming sense of peace. The asylum was silent, the whispers gone, but I felt their presence still lingering within me. As I left the old hollow asylum for the last time, I knew that I would carry their stories with me, sharing their memories with the world. I had not only freed their spirits, I had become a part of their legacy, ensuring that they would never be forgotten.